Ukraine just dealt a devastating blow to Russia's economy, and Putin is now grasping for straws. Now, I'm sure most of you guys already know, Russia is basically a gas station, as the late John McCain called it. A gas station run by a mafia that is masquerading as a country. You see, the whole economy is basically fueled by the hydrocarbon revenues that Russia generates. The problem with being so dependent on one resource is that it's easy for enemies to target it, and that's exactly what Ukraine is doing now. It has finally shut down a pipeline that Russia uses to get its oil revenue. The worst part of all this is the pipeline actually goes through Ukraine, and the obvious question I'm sure all of you guys are asking is, why did it take so long? So let's get into all that and more in today's video. Like always, be sure to hit the like button down below. It helps us out tremendously when covering war-related videos. And let's start. First, here's more details on the pipeline and why Ukraine is shutting it down right now.
President Zelensky, well, years of gas supplies from Russia to Europe sent via Ukraine have come to an end, marking an end of an era in the European Union. The route has been in place for more than 40 years, but Ukraine's President Zelensky refused to allow further transits, which he said were fueling the Russian war machine. The EU has had a year to prepare for the change, and the European Commission says the impact will be limited. Well, let's get more on this with our Central Europe correspondent, Nick Thorpe. So, Nick, just how big a deal is this?
Well, obviously, any discussion of gas, any cutting of gas supplies, as you can see on a cold winter's day like this, is very emotionally important. It's also strategically important, financially important. In practical terms, it's the end of a 5-year contract between Naftogaz of Ukraine, Gazprom of Russia. That pipeline, about 3 hours ago, ceased to receive gas. That was passing 40 million cubic meters of gas a day through to Slovakia initially, and then on to countries like Austria, Hungary and Italy.
Now, one of the things that hurts the most for Russia is the fact that the supplier that basically replacing this Russian gas is United States. And Russia is saying that this isn't really a Ukrainian decision, but rather US is putting pressure on Ukraine to do this because US profits. Now, chances of that being true is probably 0 to none, but Russia loves blaming US on anything bad that happens to Russia. They never take responsibility for anything that's their fault. If they just hadn't invaded another sovereign country, then maybe Russia's economy wouldn't be in such a bad situation and it wouldn't be just overburdened by all the sanctions that were placed after the invasion started. But anyways, I digress. Coming back to this topic, this is what President Zelensky had to say about this.
We will not continue the transit of Russian gas. We will not give them the opportunity to earn additional billions on our blood. Any country in the world that could receive something cheap from Russia, in the end, tomorrow, in a month, in a year, will become dependent on the Russian Federation. This is their policy. That's why we won't transit Russian gas anymore. The Ukrainian army currently controls the Russian town of Sucha, the entry to the pipeline. This message was sent early on New Year's Day. Greetings from the city of Sucha. The news is the following. The town is controlled by the armed forces of Ukraine. The town is calm. All buildings are intact. The strategic Gazprom facility in the city of Sucha is under the control of the 99th Mechanized Battalion of the 61st Brigade. Wishing everyone a peaceful sky.
Now, as I said earlier, the obvious question here is, why did it take so long for Ukraine to shut this down? And the answer is a bit of a twofold. The first reason being, of course, Ukraine did not want to hurt its European allies. As you guys remember in the beginning, Europe was truly dependent on Russian gas and Russian hydrocarbons, Russian oil, and Ukraine didn't want to take that away and hurt the European countries who are supporting Ukraine so much in this war, because at the end of the day, that would create domestic pressures on officials of these other countries that are supporting Ukraine. And at the end of the day, domestic policies basically beget foreign policy. So of course, that was a big reason behind why this took so long. And as mentioned in the clip we just saw, Ukraine did give a heads up to all its partners, and there was a 1-year process before this took into effect. So it wasn't something that was just a complete surprise to all the countries that were dependent on Russian gas. But moving on to the second reason, and that being Ukraine was benefiting from this. Ukraine was getting around $800 million every year from Gazprom to let the transfer of oil go through. So that was definitely very helpful for a country that was getting invaded by a bigger neighboring country. But the country that's going to be hurting even more now is in fact Russia, because even though Ukraine was making around $800 million from this, Russia was making around $5 billion a year, maybe around $7 billion from this gas that was flowing to Europe. So on Russia's side, an economy that's already in a very delicate situation, the $5 billion loss is definitely going to hurt. And this is not something that Russia can just replace very quickly. Like, it cannot just go sell this oil to China, because it's not oil, it's gas. And my bad for mixing that up. But it's harder to just build pipeline overnight to China or to India and sell them the gas, because pipelines take a long time to build. And that's when the revenue starts flowing in, once the pipeline is built and once the gas starts flowing. Clearly, this is going to be a big problem that Putin needs to figure out a solution to quickly, but this is what President Zelensky had to say on Twitter after his decision was made public. When Putin was presented with the Russian presidency more than 25 years ago, the annual gas transit through Ukraine to Europe totaled more than 130 billion cubic meters. Today, it equals 0. This is one of Moscow's biggest defeats. As a result of Russia weaponizing energy and resorting to cynical blackmail of partners, Moscow lost one of the most profitable and geographical accessible markets. Given such circumstances, the vast majority of European countries have adjusted to the changes. Our joint task today is to support Moldova during the energy transformation period. We must overcome the hysteria of some European politicians who prefer mafia-style schemes with Moscow to transparent energy policy. We also hope for an increased American gas supply to Europe, which President Trump has already mentioned. Cooperation and maximum supply from partners will result in more comfortable prices on the market. The more gas available on the market from Europe's true partners, the sooner the last remaining consequences of Europe's reliance on Russia will be eliminated. Now, I can only assume, but the fact that President Zelensky actually mentioned the American gas supply replacing the Russian gases is probably not something Putin is going to be happy about. But it could be something Zelensky is probably doing to put himself in a better position to negotiate with Trump when negotiations do come. As if that wasn't enough, this is what the Russian ruble looks like when compared to the US dollar. It just keeps on falling, like Putin's grip on power. Now, the regular Russian citizen may not care much about what Russian ruble to US dollar number is, because they think of their life in terms of rubles, not necessarily the conversion to US dollars. But Russian businesses sure as hell care a lot about how much their currency is when compared to the world's reserve currency. That's because when you're trading overseas, when you're either selling stuff or buying stuff, you need a strong currency. One of the few benefits of having a weaker currency, aka a dropping ruble, is you can export a lot of stuff, because anyone who's buying stuff from overseas now can buy Russian stuff for a cheaper price. For example, let's say we're buying pound of Russian apples and they cost 100 rubles. A week ago, $1 could have gotten us a pound of Russian apples. But now, since the ruble is lower, only 90 cents could get us a pound of Russian apples. So even though the Russian person is making the same amount, it's costing us less to buy from Russia. So we are likely going to be buying more from Russia. That's one of the big benefits of having a cheaper currency. And that's why China has been accused of artificially lowering their currency value, so to make their exports more competitive when compared to other countries. But here, Russia doesn't have such a good news, because with so many sanctions slapped on the Russian businesses, it's very hard for Russia to export a lot of stuff. So one of the rare benefits they would have from a weaker currency, they cannot use it to its fullest extent because of sanctions, which were slapped on because of Putin's invasion. Now, Russia is not getting the benefit of the weaker currency, but it is definitely getting the downside. Pretty straightforward is the fact that anything now Russia buys from overseas is going to be more expensive. this is going to lead to higher inflation for already struggling Russians. In fact, just recently in the end of the year Q&A that Putin did, he had maybe 12 questions just about the inflation, and all he kept saying is inflation is something we need to deal with, but we don't need to raise the interest rate. This was Putin's sneaky way of putting the blame for inflation onto the central government and away from him, because he doesn't want Russian people to realize that the inflation is being caused by the invasion that he started and by the government spending that's been picking up, the defense spending that's been picking up ever since the invasion turned into a 1,000-year war instead of a 3-day special military operation. And since we are talking about the special military operation, Putin's war economy, or I guess I should call it the special military economy, that's been funded by buying drones from Iran, buying soldiers and shells from North Korea, all that stuff is going to be more expensive for Putin now that ruble shows no sign of slowing down. That just means that Russia and Russian taxpayers are spending more money in a war that Russia is already losing so badly. Now, as you guys know, any war is a war of economy. Whichever country has an economy that can sustain for longer is likely going to come out ahead in the war in the long term. And that's exactly why Putin didn't want this to be a long-term war. But it seems like he has no choice but to fight a war that Ukraine just keeps on fighting on. And that's exactly why many experts, including Ukrainian officials, were calling that 2025 would be the last year the Russian economy continues, the Russian war economy that Putin likes to call a special military operation economy. That's because Russia was prepared for all the sanctions and all the backlash that it was likely going to face when it launched its special military operation. But it was not prepared for carrying out and living under sanctions for 3+ years. And as all the reserves that Putin has saved up for the last decade preparing for this special military operation dry up, the Russian economy is starting to feel the pressure of all the sanctions, and Putin is starting to feel the pressure of the war that he started. Here we have economists explaining this exact fact, how the war is basically a war of economy.
Yeah, so basically any sort of war, it's the war of the economy, right? I mean, it's a return on the investment. So for example, if Ukrainians send recently, you probably have heard about these huge ammunition depots that exploded in Russia. So Russia lost billions and billions of dollars, basically in the past, week. And the reason it came was because basically Ukraine sent drones worth of $10,000 or $20,000 or $100,000, and they destroyed billions of dollars worth of ammunition. So that's the kind of return on investment we're talking about now. When Russia targets Ukraine, they, for example, targeted one of the major producers of electricity, a plant that would be considered worth about $1 billion. They sent some heavy rockets that cost tens of millions of dollars, but you spend tens of millions of dollars, and in return you were able to destroy $1 billion. And Ukraine needs to renew that energy, and so the resources will be going into that instead of for military purposes. So that is one thing. It's an economy, right? As you pointed it out, rightfully so, it is an economic question. And the question is, where is the good return on investment? Now, the stupid investments, and something that Russia has been doing, is like hitting literally random civilian targets that don't have a significant strategic or economic value. For example, you send a military rocket into some sort of hospital or near a hospital, which, you just destroy lives, but you are not gaining anything on the economic front. And that is done to intimidate the population. It's a very simple tactic that is, done. It's a war crime. It's a horrific thing to do. And Russia usually does double tapping. When they will send the rocket, then you have police and firefighters and medical workers come on site, and then they send another rocket. And so you kill civilians, and you have more casualties, and the civilians and Ukrainian people get more fatigued, and they're like, well, forcing the government, stop this war at any cost. Well, it doesn't work. Really, it didn't work so far. The Ukrainian population and morale is very high. They're not willing to cede. And in fact, right now, Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is sort of is captive of his own people. He cannot, even if the negotiations were, if somebody was pushing him to negotiate, he cannot because people don't want to. Ukrainian people are the driving force for the even behavior of the president of Ukraine. And because they've lost so much, because Russia has been bombing them, and they got used to it, they got used to live in the middle of the war, in the middle of these horrific crimes. And they're like, well, no peace until you get out of this and pay for everything you have done. So it serves multiple purposes. And some of these purposes kind of make sense, as I said, and some of them just don't make sense.
YouTube is still not a fan of a lot of topics we cover, and that means the videos get restricted and demonetized. That's why we recently launched memberships and Patreons. This way you guys can support the content we make directly if you're able to. Because we want to continue covering this type of topics even if advertisers don't like it. We like doing it, and hopefully you guys like watching it. That's why Patreon and memberships give us a way to continue doing that without worrying about YouTube demonetizing our videos. So if you're interested and you're able to support us, you can do so by joining our Patreon or becoming a member on YouTube. The QR codes will be on the screen and the links in the description. Your support is greatly appreciated.
Ukraine has done it again. In just 48 hours, they've managed to take out entire battalions of North Korean troops fighting alongside Russia in the Kursk region. That's right, entire battalions, hundreds of soldiers at a time, have been wiped out. It's a staggering development and clearly shows just how far ahead Ukraine is in this war when it comes to strategy and technology. On January 4th, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky shared details from a briefing by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. The report emphasized the intense fighting near the village of Makhnivka, where Ukrainian forces inflicted severe casualties on their enemies. According to the briefing, during the first few days of January, battles in the area were fierce, but by the end of it, Russia had lost up to a battalion of North Korean infantry and Russian paratroopers. Zelensky also took a moment to commend Ukrainian units for their exceptional professionalism and effectiveness. He gave a special shout-out to the Special Operations Forces and the 80th Separate Air Assault Brigade for their remarkable contributions. Just so you know, this is the same elite group that spearheaded Ukraine's first surprise attack into the Kursk region last year, where they captured hundreds of miles of Russian territory and also took dozens of Russian soldiers as prisoners of war. What's even more fascinating is that just 2 days before the Kursk operation began, some of the soldiers from the 80th Separate Air Assault Brigade secretly crossed the Russian border, gathered intel, and sent it back to their command. Then they stayed hidden and waited for the action to begin. This kind of strategic brilliance is why this brigade and just overall Ukrainian units are so effective. You see, it's no secret that North Korean troops deployed in Russia are experiencing devastating losses. While the estimates of their casualties differ, all reports consistently indicate alarmingly high numbers. According to South Korea's National Intelligence Service, approximately 3,000 North Korean soldiers have been killed or severely wounded since their deployment began. Ukrainian President Zelensky has put the figure even higher, estimating around 4,000 North Korean casualties, including both killed and injured. Meanwhile, U.S. officials have reported that over 1,000 North Koreans were killed in the final weeks of December alone. Either way, these are staggering losses for a force of only 10,000 to 12,000 troops. But here's the shocking part. Despite these massive casualties, nothing is changing on the Russian side. Instead of learning from the battlefield, adapting their strategies, or better training their reinforcements, Putin seems to be doubling down on his failed tactics. Rather than addressing the root causes of these failures, unofficial reports suggest that he's prepared to throw even more money at Kim Jong-un, maybe another 200 million or even more, for a fresh batch of North Korean soldiers. And I'm not kidding. Several reports suggest that Kim Jong-un might already be preparing another group of innocent and clueless soldiers to send straight into Russia's meat grinder. But wait, before we get any further into this video, let's take a moment to break down something important. I want to explain how a North Korean battalion operates and their age-old strategies, which, interestingly enough, are pretty similar to the Russians. Once we've got that covered, we'll compare their approach to how the Ukrainians handle things. And to wrap it all up, I'll share a great example that shows why smart strategy has always been more effective than just throwing sheer manpower at the front lines. Something history has proven time and time again. First, like always, remember to hit that like button on the video below. It helps me out tremendously. So first things first, North Korea boasts one of the largest militaries in the world, with approximately 1.3 million active duty personnel and millions more in reserve. A North Korean battalion typically consists of 300 to 500 soldiers, depending on its mission and resources. This is just an estimate and aligns with the structure observed during the Korean War, where battalions were organized into 3 rifle companies and a headquarters company, each contributing to the total battalion strength. Each company usually has 8,120 soldiers, sometimes even more, and then this is further broken into platoons and squads. These are the backbone of the battalion, responsible for direct combat. There's also a command unit at the top, and of course, political officers embedded throughout. These officers aren't there to lead or strategize. They're there to ensure ideological loyalty, making sure every soldier remembers their ultimate duty to serve the regime. That's a major red flag right there. Imagine being on the front lines of a modern battlefield, where decisions need to be quick and flexible. But instead, you're stuck with a rigid hierarchy, where even the smallest decision requires layers of approval. It's a setup designed to maintain control, not win wars. Now let's talk about training, or should I say, the lack of it. You see, North Korean soldiers are conditioned in a very narrow and rigid way. They're trained to perform manual labor and have only the most basic combat skills. Beyond that, their diet consists of moldy cabbage and an endless stream of propaganda. Every day, they're forced to spend hours memorizing quotes from Kim Jong-un or practicing absolute blind obedience to orders, as if the food wasn't less and bad enough. This kind of mental strain completely drains their ability to think on their feet. Instead, they're reduced to functioning like empty mechanical cans of meat. North Korean soldiers are tough, no doubt about it. They can endure harsh conditions, march for miles, and survive on minimal food. But toughness doesn't win wars, training does. Turns out that even North Korea's elite forces are still trained, using the same outdated tactics they relied on decades ago. The same old static trench warfare, human wave attacks, and mass artillery barrages. Most of their drills are physical, like marching in formation, hand-to-hand combat, and handling outdated rifles. These are skills that might have been useful in, say, the 1950s, but in today's world, where drones can take you out from miles away, this kind of training is practically useless. Even during the Korean War, North Korea had the full support of the Soviet Union, which played a huge role in shaping its military strategy and operations. The tactics they used weren't particularly sophisticated, but they were brutally effective at first. Overwhelm the enemy with sheer manpower, rely on static defenses, and rain down relentless artillery barrages. These methods worked in the early days of the war, catching South Korean and US forces completely off guard. Within weeks, North Korean troops managed to push deep into the south. If that sounds familiar, it's because Russia did something eerily similar in Ukraine. They used overwhelming force and numbers to throw Ukraine off balance and, at one point, came dangerously close to capturing Kyiv. But for both North Korea back then and Russia now, their early successes quickly turned into catastrophic failures. Take one of their most infamous tactics, the human wave attack. The concept is simple. Send wave after wave of troops to overwhelm the enemy physically and mentally. On paper, it sounds effective, but in reality, it's nothing short of a massacre. For every tiny stretch of ground gained, the attacking forces would lose hundreds, sometimes even thousands, of soldiers. But here's the thing. Both South Korea during the Korean War and Ukraine today weren't just sitting ducks. They adapted. By the later stages of these conflicts, the human wave tactic became so predictable that it was practically suicidal. Defenders would dig in, set up their lines, and wait for the charge. When it inevitably came, they would mow down the attackers in droves. It was brutal, but it was effective. Another key tactic used by North Korea during the Korean War was static trench warfare. They constructed extensive networks of trenches, bunkers, and minefields, creating what seemed on paper to be impenetrable fortifications. These defenses were designed to slow down advancing forces, exhaust their resources, and inflict heavy casualties over time. At first glance, it appeared to be a sound strategy, offering a sense of security to North Korean forces. But this very same thing turned into a glaring weakness. You see, once enemy forces identified vulnerabilities in these fortifications or managed to encircle them, they became deadly traps. US forces, leveraging their air superiority, turned these trenches into graveyards with relentless bombing campaigns. At the same time, South Korean troops executed precision ground assaults, targeting weak points in the defensive lines and exploiting gaps to devastating effect. In comparison, South Korea adopted a far more flexible and adaptive approach. Instead of relying on static defenses, they focused on mobility, strategic withdrawals, and counterattacks. When faced with overwhelming North Korean offensives, South Korean forces often pulled back to regroup, drawing the enemy into overextended positions. Once the North Koreans were exposed, they countered with coordinated ground assaults supported by American air power. This approach allowed South Korea to regain ground and turn the tide of the war. Fast forward to today, and we see a similar story unfolding in Ukraine. While trenches do play a role in Ukraine's defense, they aren't the cornerstone of their strategy. Instead, Ukrainian forces use a combination of hit-and-run tactics, highly coordinated counteroffensives, and modern technology, like drones and precision-guided weaponry, to outmaneuver Russian troops. Another glaring weakness for North Korea was and still is its rigid top-down command structure. You see, during the war, orders were issued from the highest levels, and field commanders had little to no autonomy to adapt to changing battlefield conditions. While this kind of centralized control worked for simple operations, like coordinating mass attacks, it became a major liability during complex and fast-changing battles. A perfect example of this weakness is the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter. At first, North Korean forces held a significant advantage, pushing South Korean and U.S. troops into a narrow corner of the Korean peninsula. Their strategy of overwhelming the enemy seemed to be working. However, everything changed when the U.S. launched a daring counteroffensive at Incheon. This bold amphibious assault disrupted North Korean supply lines and flanked their forces. Despite the battlefield shifting rapidly, North Korean commanders stubbornly clung to their original orders, refusing to adapt to the new reality unfolding around them. Their rigid chain of command left no room for quick decision-making, which proved disastrous during the U.S. counteroffensive at Incheon. By the time they realized what was happening, the damage had already been done. Their forces were surrounded, their supply lines were severed, and what could have been a fighting retreat turned into a complete collapse. This inability to adapt didn't just cost them the battle, it changed the entire course of the war. Now fast forward to modern times, and we see history repeating itself. Look at what happened during the events in Kursk. Russian commanders reportedly had intelligence suggesting that Ukraine might launch an attack. But instead of taking the warning seriously, they dismissed the possibility outright. They didn't believe Ukraine had the capability, or perhaps the audacity, to strike into Russian territory. This arrogance left key border areas poorly secured, and when the attack finally came, it caught them completely off guard. What's worse, instead of acting quickly and decisively, the Russian commanders panicked. They were so entrenched in their rigid hierarchy that they refused to make decisions on their own. They waited for orders from above, leaving critical moments of response wasted. By the time those orders came, the damage was done. Several dozens of Russian soldiers gave up and surrendered, and the rest ended up retreating. Now, coming back to the Korean War, let's see how South Korea and the US handled things differently. What set them apart wasn't just better equipment or air superiority, it was their adaptability. For instance, during the Battle of the Pusan Perimeter, North Korean forces initially held a significant advantage. However, the tide turned dramatically with the US counteroffensive at Incheon. As I said, North Korean commanders were slow to adapt, and they stuck to their original orders. By the time they finally reacted, it was too late. This same inability to adjust is likely why, just recently, an entire North Korean battalion was wiped out in only 2 days. But what about the Ukrainian side? Well, let's take a closer look at Ukraine's 413th Raid Separate Battalion, one of the first units to join the Kursk operation. Their role in the operation offers a glimpse into how Ukraine has managed to maintain its edge on the battlefield. First, it's important to note that the Kursk operation was planned and executed with extraordinary secrecy. Heavy equipment and military units were moved to the border with Russia in the Sumy region, camouflaged among forests to avoid detection. The operation was so covert that it wasn't even hinted at in the media or by military analysts until the offensive was already underway. For the first few days after the breakthrough, there was complete silence from Ukrainian officials. Only later did the military begin to reveal how the operation unfolded in August. At this point, the fighting in the Kursk region has been ongoing for 6 months. Despite all of Russia's efforts, including the deployment of thousands of North Korean reinforcements, they've only managed to recapture around 40 to 60% of their own territory. The lack of significant progress speaks volumes about Ukraine's operational competence. Now, the success of Ukraine's operations in Kursk isn't just about one battalion. While the 413th Raid's separate battalion of unmanned aerial systems plays a vital role, they're part of a much larger, coordinated effort. Dozens of units are working together, sharing intelligence, providing support, and operating like a well-oiled machine. Unlike the rigid, isolated strategies seen on the Russian side, Ukraine's forces demonstrate a high level of coordination and adaptability, functioning as a single cohesive entity. Upon reaching their deployment point, the unmanned team of the 413th Raid Separate Battalion wastes no time getting to work. They quickly unload their equipment, set up antennas, and prepare their drones for action. One of their key tools is a large, airplane-type drone designed for long-range surveillance. This drone is the backbone of their operations, tasked with identifying concentrations of enemy personnel, equipment, and high-priority Russian targets. In addition to reconnaissance, the team plays a crucial role in adjusting the fire for other Ukrainian units, ensuring strikes are precise and effective. For instance, one of their most notable successes was detecting and facilitating the destruction of a Russian S-400 missile defense system located north of Kursk. If this system had gone unnoticed, it could have posed a catastrophic threat to Ukrainian troops operating in the region. The team's mobility adds another layer of effectiveness. Operating out of a mini office set up in a vehicle, they can quickly relocate to avoid detection by Russian forces, maintaining their element of surprise. But the team doesn't work alone. For example, during one operation, their long-range drone not only confirmed the location of the S-400 system, but also detected a Russian super camera and a jeep equipped with an electronic warfare device. The drone also tracked the movements of Russian troops. All of this intelligence, including precise coordinates, was relayed to other Ukrainian units, who systematically neutralized the threats one by one. Thanks to this single, long-range drone, the 413th Battalion identified over 20 Russian electronic warfare systems, including the Borisoglebsk R-330 Zhytel and the rare Krasuka 4. These systems are critical components of Russia's electronic warfare capabilities, and their removal significantly disrupted Russian operations in the region. But this is just one piece of Ukraine's broader strategy. Apart from this, one of Ukraine's most effective strategies in this war has been ensuring the survivability of its command posts. In modern warfare, where every unit relies on others to achieve the best possible outcomes, command posts are the backbone of operations. Drone units need ground troops to eliminate electronic warfare systems. Ground troops rely on artillery and heavy machinery to handle tanks, large groups of soldiers, and air support. Artillery, in turn, depends on drones for accurate targeting and reconnaissance. It's a complex, interconnected system where every part plays a critical role, but it all ultimately depends on the command posts. Command posts are the nerve centers of the battlefield. They're where decisions are made, where a clear and timely picture of the situation is developed, and where plans are adjusted to match the changing dynamics of war. Without a functioning command post, the entire chain of operations falls apart. This is where Ukraine has excelled, demonstrating incredible effectiveness in maintaining its command post survivability, something Russia and North Korea have struggled with significantly. But Russia is fully aware of the importance of command posts and has made consistent efforts to target them. Ukrainian command posts are under constant threat from unmanned aircraft systems, indirect fire, and electronic warfare attacks. However, despite these relentless attempts, Russia has largely failed to neutralize them, thanks to Ukraine's meticulous planning and adaptability. For a command post to survive in large-scale combat operations, planners must take into account an intricate web of factors and implement new tactics, techniques, and procedures for its design, placement, and camouflage. It's not as simple as just hiding or fortifying a location. There's a lot that goes into this decision. For instance, mission, enemy, terrain, and weather, troops and support available, time available, civil considerations, and more. All these factors work together to determine the command post's location and survivability. Ukrainian command posts are typically located about 2 to 5 kilometers from the front line, with their combat trains, command posts positioned further back, approximately 10 kilometers from the action. Further these posts are from the front line, the better they're protected from detection and indirect fire. underground facilities, such as basements, offer the best protection. They not only shield personnel and equipment, but also mask electromagnetic emissions, reducing the chances of enemy detection without requiring extensive additional measures. When basements aren't available, Ukrainian forces take matters into their own hands by constructing underground earth fortifications. To further enhance protection and secrecy, Ukrainian units make creative use of existing infrastructure. In urban areas, tunnels and sewers are often repurposed to create hidden passages and establish secure lines of communication. In clusters of buildings, soldiers punch holes between walls, creating concealed routes that allow them to move undetected and mislead the enemy. However, many battles occur in rural areas where infrastructure is limited. In these scenarios, Ukraine maximizes the available resources by dispersing forces across surrounding buildings, forests, and terrain. Forested areas in particular offer dense vegetation that provides natural camouflage and limits the enemy's ability to locate and attack command positions. To secure forest-based command posts, Ukrainian troops dig fighting positions to protect personnel and equipment. These positions are designed with both functionality and safety in mind. They are dug as deep as possible and feature an L-shaped entrance, which helps block direct fire and shrapnel. Inside, they construct an inner wall for additional protection and reinforce the roof to shield against potential artillery or airstrikes. All of these measures are typically enough to throw off Russian detection efforts, but the Ukrainians aren't taking any chances. To further mislead the enemy, they employ clever deception tactics and set up convincing dummies. One of their most effective tricks is using radio signal emitter decoys that mimic the operations of repeater systems, tricking Russian forces into believing they've located a real command post. Another clever method involves deploying mobile teams that imitate command and staff radio transmissions. These teams deliberately broadcast signals that draw Russian attention, making them think they've pinpointed a critical command center. In response, Russian forces often deploy UAVs and UAS drones for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. One of the key things these drones look for is the telltale Starlink antenna system, which is essential for Ukrainian communications. Here's where it gets even more interesting. The Ukrainians use fake Starlink setups to bait the Russians. They might take an object painted white, wrap it in a white tablecloth, or even use chalk to give it the appearance of a Starlink antenna. They'll place this decoy near a strategically chosen area, laying out fake cables to make it look like a legitimate connection. Other deception tactics involve simulating normal, everyday activity to make fake sites seem authentic. For example, they'll hang pants on a line, drape a coat over the back of a chair, scatter cigarette butts, candy wrappers, or other signs of life around the location. Sometimes they'll even tow broken equipment or faulty vehicles to the decoy site, setting them up to look like operational and valuable assets. These little details make the decoys incredibly convincing. Once Russian forces are convinced they've found a key Ukrainian site, they unleash a barrage of attacks. Hundreds of artillery shells, suicide drones, and even missiles are sent to obliterate the fake target. From the Russian perspective, it looks like a major victory. They believe they've struck a crucial Ukrainian command post. In reality, all they've done is waste time, ammunition, and resources on a ghost. Meanwhile, Ukraine uses this diversion to its advantage. As Russian forces waste their energy on decoys, Ukrainian units focus on real operations elsewhere, making meaningful progress on the battlefield. This not only drains Russian resources, but also boosts Ukrainian morale as they continue to outsmart and outmaneuver their adversaries. It's a brilliant display of how strategic deception can turn an enemy's aggression into a self-inflicted setback. Earlier in this video, I mentioned that I'd share a great historical example to show you why smart strategy has always been far more effective than simply throwing sheer manpower at the front lines. Now let me take you back centuries, all the way to the year 1177. It was a time of crusades, kingdoms, and legendary leaders. But this isn't just any story. It's about one of the most remarkable underdog victories in history, led by a 16-year-old king who defied every expectation. At the time, King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem faced what seemed like an impossible challenge. At just 16 years old, Baldwin stood against Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, whose reputation as a brilliant military leader and strategist was already well established. Saladin commanded a force of 26,000 men, while Baldwin's army consisted of a mere 375 knights and about 1,000 infantry. The odds were staggering. For most, this would have been unwinnable, but Baldwin wasn't like most. Born in 1161 as the son of King Amalric I of Jerusalem, Baldwin's early years seemed destined to follow the typical path of a nobleman. As the heir to the throne, he was expected to train in the arts of war, learning swordplay, horsemanship, and how to command troops in battle. But his path took a sharp turn when, at just 9 years old, Baldwin was diagnosed with leprosy. In the medieval world, leprosy was seen not just as a debilitating disease, but as a curse, isolating its sufferers both physically and socially. Baldwin's condition forced him to grow up differently from his peers. His body, slowly succumbing to the disease, couldn't endure the rigorous training other young nobles received. He couldn't spar with a sword or practice mounted combat like his father and other knights. This physical isolation could easily have bred despair, but for Baldwin, it became an opportunity. Cut off from the typical education of a warrior prince, Baldwin turned inward, channeling his energy into intellectual pursuits. He immersed himself in the study of history, strategy, and the great battles of the past. From the dusty scrolls and tomes of his tutors, he learned about the triumphs of Alexander the Great, who had conquered vast empires with cunning and adaptability. He studied Julius Caesar, who turned seemingly insurmountable odds into victories through strategic brilliance. He examined the defensive tactics of Byzantine generals, who had mastered the art of fortifications and attrition in the face of larger forces. Baldwin didn't just read about these leaders, he analyzed their decisions. Why did Alexander strike when he did? What terrain did Caesar use to his advantage? How did the Byzantines hold off waves of invaders for centuries? These weren't just stories to Baldwin, they were lessons. Every campaign and every battle he studied became a building block in the young prince's growing arsenal of tactical knowledge. So when the time finally came, he applied that knowledge to the battlefield. In November 1177, Saladin launched an ambitious invasion, believing the kingdom of Jerusalem was vulnerable. Baldwin, facing Saladin's larger force, knew that an open field battle would be suicidal. Instead, he used his understanding of the terrain to bait Saladin into a narrow pass near Montgizard, where the Sultan's numerical advantage would be neutralized. Saladin's army, laden with loot and overconfident after its unchecked advance, was caught off guard. Baldwin personally led the charge. Despite his physical frailty, his presence on the battlefield inspired his troops, reminding them that even their leprous king was willing to fight and die for their cause. The Crusader Knights, bolstered by Baldwin's leadership, launched devastating charges, while the narrow pass created chaos in Saladin's ranks. The result was astonishing. Baldwin's outnumbered army routed Saladin's forces, turning what should have been a decisive Muslim victory into a humiliating defeat. Saladin himself barely escaped the battlefield with his life, a rare failure for a leader who had built a reputation as one of the greatest military minds of the medieval world. Baldwin's triumph at the Battle of Montgizard remains one of the most remarkable examples of how strategy, courage, and leadership can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. He showed the world that even the greatest challenges can be overcome with the right mindset and plan. Today, Ukraine is writing its own version of this story. Just like Baldwin's outnumbered forces, Ukraine faces a formidable opponent with greater numbers and resources. Yet through strategic brilliance, innovative tactics, and a deep sense of purpose, they've managed to hold their ground and even achieve significant victories.
Before moving on, I want to mention that I'm tired of seeing ads everywhere I go. I mean, how many ads has YouTube shown on this video alone? And that's why we launched a newsletter a few years ago called Global Recaps. We've been sending daily news right to you with no ads. Yeah, that's right. We have sent 2,500 newsletters to date, but not one of them contained an ad. So, if you want global news with no ads and no censorship, this is the solution for you. Sign up now by scanning the QR code on the screen or the link in the description. Sign up today and become more knowledgeable about the world you live in.
The Russo-Ukrainian conflict began a lot longer ago than most people think. It began nearly 10 years ago, when Vladimir Putin annexed or essentially stole the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine without firing a single bullet. In 2014, armed soldiers without insignias began occupying Crimea, and despite evidence of Russian weapons being used, Putin denied any involvement. 2 months later, however, Putin would go on to declare Crimea as part of Russia, which began the current Russo-Ukrainian conflict. But how did this happen? To understand how Russia managed to annex Crimea so easily, we must first look into the history of the peninsula in order to provide some context. First, be sure to hit the like button. It helps us out a lot when covering topics like this that YouTube often restricts because they're not advertiser friendly. Let's start. Like most of Europe, Ukraine has had a complex history of shifting territoriality and sovereignty, and a particularly antagonistic relationship with Russia. In its early history, the Crimean Peninsula had been settled and conquered by different groups such as the Cimmerians, the Scythians, the Greeks, and eventually the Romans by around 15 BCE. Major Slavic influence began by the 10th century, when Prince Vladimir I of Kievan Rus began a claim on the peninsula. However, the Tatars from the Golden Horde took over the peninsula, establishing outposts and cities, and eventually coming to dominate the Black Sea trade. By the early 14th century, Islam began to have heavy influence on the Tatar population on the peninsula, and the Golden Horde became the Khanate of Crimea. By 1475, the Khanate surrendered to the Ottomans, and Crimea was dominated by Ottoman rule for several centuries until the late 17th century, when the Russian Empire began a southern expansion under Peter I. After several conflicts between the Russians and the Ottomans, a decisive conflict which was fought from 1768 to 1744 concluded with the Treaty of Kukuk-Kainarka, in which the Ottoman Empire ceded a few fortresses on the Kerch Peninsula to the Russian Empire, and it also established an independent Crimean Tatar state. These early conflicts already began to establish animosity between Russia and the Crimean Tatars, although it's always interesting to note that Kiev was the first Slavic state to lay a claim on the peninsula. Eventually, in 1783, Catherine II the Great from Russia annexed the entire peninsula into the Russian Empire. During this period, there was still a great rivalry between the Russians and the Turks that still inhabited the peninsula, and such tensions escalated into an all-out war in Europe, with the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856. Britain and France opposing Russian expansion and encroachment over the Ottoman-held Danubian principalities, engulfing what today is Romania, began a siege of Sevastopol, displacing many Crimean Tatars to other parts of Russia, as would later happen during Soviet rule. In the late 19th century, Ukraine fell into the hands of the Russian Empire, and after a brief independence in 1918 after World War I, the Soviet Union annexed Ukraine as an autonomous socialist Soviet republic. In the particular case of Crimea, after the Russian Revolution of 1917, during which the Russian Empire collapsed, the Crimean Tatars that still remained in the peninsula declared independence as a democratic republic. However, after the Russian Civil War from 1918 to 1920, the remaining white or anti-Bolshevik forces had taken refuge in Crimea. The victory of the Bolsheviks during that war caused the collapse of the independent Crimean Republic and saw its establishment as the Crimean Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic in 1921. During Soviet rule, particularly when Stalin was in power, ethnic Tatars in Crimea were suppressed and exiled. Most of the remaining Crimean Tatars were forcibly deported to Siberia and other Soviet republics across Central Asia in 1944 for allegedly cooperating with Nazis during World War II. After the war, Crimea went from being an autonomous socialist republic to a region or oblast of the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, or Soviet Russia for short. It was passed over to Ukraine, the Soviet Ukraine Republic that is, in 1954. In the 1980s and early 1990s, as the USSR began to crumble, many Tatars began returning to Crimea, and it even became an autonomous republic once more in 1991. However, shortly after, the USSR collapsed, and it came under the jurisdiction of the newly independent Ukraine. To that point, still, the majority of the population of Crimea was ethnically Russian, which already complicated relations between Kiev and Crimea. In addition, Russia still maintained interests in the region due to its strategic position on the shores of the Black Sea and it being the location of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Crimea also lost more of its autonomy after a brief independence movement in 1994 saw the abolition of the position of President of the Autonomous Republic. Despite the 1994 Budapest Memorandum signed by Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and the United Kingdom, in which these countries committed to respect Ukraine's post-Soviet borders, and Ukraine in turn committed to transfer its Soviet-era nuclear weapons stockpile back to Russia, Putin had other plans in mind. This memorandum, by the way, also led to the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Partnership of 1997 between Russia and Ukraine, which would protect Ukraine's sovereign border and, in turn, extend Russia's lease on Sevastopol to keep its Black Sea fleet. With Crimea now seemingly settled as Ukrainian territory, Ukraine continued to balance its European ambitions with the lingering, albeit uneasy, ties that it maintained with Russia. Even during this uneasy peace, tensions still continued. For example, in 2003, Russia attempted to build a dam in the Kerch Strait which caused a diplomatic incident, which was characterized by the Ukrainian government as infringement on its territory. This would become an understatement, considering what transpired during the next 2 decades. Other significant events that would cause tension within the region were when the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Volodymyr Ozhrysko in September 2008 accused the Russian government of issuing Russian passports to residents in Crimea, in light of Russia's policy of direct military intervention abroad to protect Russian citizens. It also didn't help that pro-Russian factions within the Crimean parliament and the Ukrainian parliament as well for that matter would also support the anti-Ukraine and pro-Russian demonstrations, such as the ones held in August 2009, with the major arguments being that Crimea had a Russian-majority population. Pro-Russian ministers such as Sergei Tsekov of the Russian bloc expressed hopes that Russia would treat Crimea like South Ossetia and Abkhazia, 2 Georgian separatist regions which have expressed interest in joining the Russian Federation, and which Russia actively supported, particularly during its 2008 military intervention in Georgia. It's been speculated as well that Russia had already begun planning to annex Crimea as early as 2010. During the 21st century, the Orange Revolution shook up the Ukrainian political landscape. During this period, a pro-Russian movement within Crimea that supported Ukraine's pro-Russian leader Viktor Yanukovych began to take shape. When Yanukovych became the president of Ukraine in 2010, he extended Russia's lease to use Sevastopol until 2042, and he also allowed the Kremlin to deploy 25,000 troops into the city, as well as a couple of air bases in Crimea. By 2012, the Ukrainian government was also in the middle of negotiating a deal to further integrate Ukraine into the European Union. However, President Yanukovych failed to sign any deal during a last-minute delay in 2013, mostly due to pressure from Putin, and he instead opted for closer ties with Russia. This caused outrage among the Ukrainian population, and in November 2013, mass protests sparked, which became known as the Euromaidan. The protests were also fueled by a huge perception of government corruption, which further complicated matters for the Ukrainian government. On a side note to the pro-Russian demonstrations already causing fears of the Kremlin's intervention, on February 4, 2014, the Russian judiciary seemed poised to hold a referendum on the peninsula's status, which was responded to by the Ukrainian Security Service opening a criminal investigation for the possible subversion of Ukraine's territorial integrity. Finally, on February 21, 2014, all of these factors combined caused President Yanukovych to flee Ukraine via Crimea to Russia. The following day, the Ukrainian parliament voted to oust him as president. A new interim government was established, and it was internationally recognized except for Russia, of course, which viewed the ousting of Yanukovych as a coup d'etat. Putin would see this new government as a threat to his interests in Ukraine. So on February 22nd and 23rd, he convened a night-long meeting with his security ministers to discuss the possible return of the exiled Yanukovych from Russia back to Ukraine and his potential reinstatement as president. Finishing the meeting, Putin remarked that Russia had to begin preparing to return Crimea back to Russia. In the following days, the Kremlin would negotiate with local pro-Russian activists and facilitators to cause further unrest and make it easier for Russia to seamlessly take over the peninsula without major complications. Protests started on February 23rd, beginning with the pro-Russian demonstration held in Sevastopol. The Prime Minister of Crimea, Anatoly Moilyov, recognized the new interim government in Kiev and committed to respecting any laws passed by the new parliament. Counter-protests in the cities of Simferopol ensued the next day in response to the pro-Russian demonstration, which had led to the replacement of the Ukrainian flag of the parliament for a Russian flag. These protests were in support of the new government in Kiev, and in a similar fashion as the Euromaidan protests from the previous months, demanded the respect of Ukrainian sovereignty and promoted European integration as well as respect for Tatar civil rights. The pro-Russian protests continued in Sevastopol, with the added support of local Russian biker gangs such as the Night Wolves, and chants could be heard saying, "Putin is our president," and protesters would refuse to pay taxes to the Ukrainian government. These protests spread from Sevastopol to the culturally significant region of Kerch in eastern Crimea, during which protesters were wearing signature Russian military emblems, such as the orange and black St. George ribbon, and even flags of the pro-Russian Crimean Party of Russian Unity. On February 24th, the pro-Russian demonstrations in Sevastopol escalated to the point of demanding a Russian citizen be elected mayor of the city, and this led to the resignation of the incumbent mayor Volodymyr Yatsuba. That same day, Alexei Shally, a Russian citizen, was illegally appointed mayor of Sevastopol. Tensions between Kiev and the separatist administration in the city of Sevastopol escalated on February 25th, when the pro-Russian demonstrators blocked the Crimean parliament and began demanding a referendum on the status of Crimea, as well as the non-recognition of the new interim government of Ukraine. Many analysts also consider the election of Shally in Sevastopol as a form of coup, and this is widely seen as the green light to further legitimize and facilitate Putin's eventual incursion into Crimea in a less bloody manner. The next day, on February 26th, nearly 5,000 Crimean Tatars gathered with Euromaidan protesters by the Supreme Council of Crimea, or Verkhovna Rada of Crimea, building in Simferopol, to face around 700 pro-Russian protesters and supporters of the Russian Unity Party. The Tatars and their allies were advocating for the Crimean parliament not to even consider the idea of separating Crimea from Ukraine. And while the parliament denied these allegations and promised to hold debates on the matter, this response was seen as weak and feeble to pro-Russian pressure. The new interim Ukrainian government held the naive belief that the tensions could be resolved via dialogue and would direct the Ukrainian security service to try and prevent direct physical confrontations between the two opposing protester factions in Crimea. The government also requested UN surveillance of the situation. However, Putin, taking advantage of the special position that Russia already held in Sevastopol prior to the escalation of tensions and protests, and since the 1997 Treaty of Friendship, ordered Russian troops already stationed there to take control of the main highway to Sevastopol. He also ordered the establishment of a Russian military checkpoint in the middle of the highway between Sevastopol and Simferopol. With all of the pieces now in motion, on the fateful day of February 27, 2014, the aforementioned soldiers without insignias, also known colloquially as the Little Green Men, arrived in Crimea and seized key sites and buildings across the peninsula, including the Crimean parliament. They surrounded the airports of both Simferopol and Sevastopol, Crimea's major cities. Pro-Russian activists and forces also took to the streets and occupied localities in the southern Ukrainian Kherson Oblast, located just north of Crimea, as well as along the Arabat Spit or landform, which is located right along Crimea's Sea of Azov coastline. At the same time, the Crimean parliament voted during an emergency session to put an end to the Crimean government and to establish Sergei Aksyonov as the prime minister in place of Anatoly Mohyliov. Aksyonov was selected by a majority of pro-Russian legislators of the Crimean parliament to be the prime minister of the Republic of Crimea. In reality, it can be said that these actions were the true coup d'etat, because Russia used military force to take over the government and military facilities of Crimea, and not the deposition and exile of Yanukovych. Despite having only 4% of the vote during the last Crimean election, the Russian Unity Party managed to place Aksyonov in power with the help of the Little Green Men, cutting communications from the parliament building as well as intimidating opposing MPs. They also resorted to twisting the Ukrainian law in the appointment of the Prime Minister of Crimea. The law stated that the Prime Minister can only be appointed by the Supreme Council of Crimea as well as with consultation of the Ukrainian President. Aksyonov would recognize the pro-Russian exiled Ukrainian leader Yanukovych as the de jure president of Ukraine. Therefore, he would answer to him on the question of his election as prime minister and would find it justified to ask the Kremlin for assistance to uphold the legitimacy of Yanukovych's authority, since Yanukovych was at the moment being given asylum by Russia. By this point, Crimea was practically controlled by Russia in all but name. The parliament would go on to vote to hold a referendum for more Crimean autonomy from Ukraine, set to be held on May 25th. The little green men also facilitated this vote via the same intimidation tactics on MPs and cutting communications from the Parliament building. They also blocked independent journalists from entering the building while the vote was being held. Therefore, it wasn't possible to know whether all the MPs were even present to vote. Add to that the external Russian intimidation, and you get a cornered parliament forced to place a coup on itself and its sovereign government. This, of course, was deemed illegal by the Ukrainian interim government. That same day, Russian forces disguised as Ukrainian local Berkut police units established military checkpoints on the two key bridge areas that connect Crimea to the rest of Ukraine, those being the Isthmus of Perekop and the Shanghar Peninsula. After a few hours, Crimea had essentially been cut off from the rest of Ukraine, both physically and in terms of telecommunications. Ukrainian TV channels became unavailable to Crimean residents. Many Kremlin-sponsored TV channels and radio stations began transmitting in place of the old Ukrainian channels. March 1, 2014, the illegitimate Crimean Prime Minister Sergei Aksyonov, in close collaboration with Putin, called for his assistance to bring peace and stability to Crimea, after which Putin received swift authorization from the Federal Council of Russia to officially militarily intervene in Ukraine until the social situation in the country was normalized. Sound familiar? This certainly sounds eerily similar to the justifications made for the special military operation that would begin nearly exactly 8 years later. Essentially, by March 2nd, Russian troops took full control over Crimea, moving from their established base in Sevastopol into the rest of the peninsula with additional military support from mainland Russia. On March 4th, it was reported that staff from Russian ground and air forces were now present in Crimea, instead of only the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which was a clear violation of the international agreement signed by Russia and Ukraine in 1997. That same day, Putin denied any plans to annex Crimea, despite clear evidence showing the contrary. This has become an ongoing pattern, in which the Russian government publicly denies being involved in military operations abroad. Putin even went as far to say that the insignia-less troops, or little green men, were nothing more than ordinary citizens exercising their rights to free speech and to self-determination. Eventually, Putin revealed that he had in fact deployed the insignia-less masked soldiers to take Crimea, and he also admitted to having ordered the reincorporation of Crimea into Russia since early February. The United States and the United Kingdom accused Russia of violating the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, in which it had committed to respecting Ukraine's territorial integrity. Putin vaguely claimed that the agreement didn't apply in this situation because it involved issues of international political and socio-economic factors. Mr. Putin would continue to claim that the presence of Russian troops in Crimea was to ensure that the will of the Crimean people was respected and their integrity secured, as well as to protect Russian citizens in Crimea. This continues to be the same rhetoric that's been used during the latest escalation of the Russo-Ukrainian war resulting from Putin's ground invasion of Ukraine. In order to legally annex Crimea into the Russian Federation, the parliament passed legislation to alter the Russian law on admitting new federal subjects into the Federation, making it easier for a subdivision of a foreign state to request to join in the absence of efficient governance in its sovereign home state. This definition would be applied to the new interim government of Ukraine, which was seen as corrupt and illegitimate by Russia. On March 11th, the government of Crimea, now headed by the pro-Russian Prime Minister Sergei Aksyonov and pro-Russian members of the Supreme Council of Crimea, declared the independence of Crimea from Ukraine and their intent on fully joining Russia. The Kremlin used the precedent of the 2008 Kosovo Declaration of Independence to justify Crimea's own declaration of intent. On the day that Russia officially took over Crimea, the referendum date was moved from May 25th to March 30th. And then, in early March, it was pushed even further to March 16th. On that day, the referendum was convened on the status of Crimea and its official secession from Ukraine and accession to the Russian Federation. The results showed 97% in favor of joining Russia. Despite these results being later revealed to be inflated, a staunch 50 to 60% of Russian-majority Crimean voters still supported the annexation. However, these results and the manner of conducting the referendum itself were not recognized by Ukraine, the United States, or the European Union. Some reports showed that any citizen with a Russian passport, regardless of their residency status in Crimea, was allowed to vote in the referendum, and the only international observers that monitored the referendum were far-right European entities that were mostly aligned with Putin. The short-lived independent Republic of Crimea was recognized by Putin on March 17th and later admitted as a federal subject of Russia 4 days later, when Putin signed the treaty on the accession of the Republic of Crimea to Russia on March 18th. Despite few remaining violent confrontations, the Russian troops were able to continue taking over the remaining Ukrainian military bases in Crimea, and by March 24th, Ukraine ordered the full withdrawal of its armed forces from Crimea, with some Ukrainian soldiers even defecting to the Russian army. Despite international condemnation, including a non-binding resolution adopted by the United Nations General Assembly, which did not recognize the Crimean referendum nor subsequent annexation by Russia, Putin's government began to swiftly enact legislation and public action to incorporate Crimea into the Russian economy. This further proves that the United Nations General Assembly has little leverage, and their resolutions are mostly symbolic and can affect international relations to some degree. Any more meaningful action that could have been done by the United Nations Security Council would be impossible due to Russia's veto power as a permanent member. The Russian government then denounced the 1997 treaty with Ukraine, citing problems with the renting relationship that Russia previously had with Ukraine regarding the Russian Navy's lease on Sevastopol. Putin also began action to reintegrate formerly exiled Crimean Tatars, who had been ousted from Crimea in 1944 by Stalin. During the ensuing months, Crimea continued to integrate itself into the Russian Federation, becoming part of Russia's southern military district, adopting the Russian phone number system in place of the Ukrainian system, and the introduction of a new central bank which only accepted Russian currency. The Crimean annexation caused a surge in popularity for Putin domestically, as well as strengthening Russian nationalism, despite international sanctions and partial recognition of the so-called treaty. Ukraine, of course, did not recognize the annexation and labeled it as occupation and violation of its sovereign integrity, and imposed certain restrictions on Ukrainians traveling to and from Crimea. Some of the more significant international sanctions included banning certain Russian political officials from traveling to countries like Canada and the United States. However, these measures did not change anything for the situation on the ground. The international response was not as strong as it could have been, and the ensuing economic and visa-related sanctions imposed on Russia by Western actors such as the United States and the European Union did not deter or reverse the annexation. Russia was also expelled from the G8, reverting it back to the G7, and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe removed Russia's voting rights. Despite the condemnation, other world leaders openly supported Russia's military actions in Ukraine and Crimea, including Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, as well as Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro. Other countries that ended up recognizing the annexation included Afghanistan, Cuba, North Korea, Kyrgyzstan, Nicaragua, Sudan, and Zimbabwe. China maintained a position of non-interference and merely stated that they would respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, without directly mentioning or condemning Putin's annexation of Crimea. India would also not directly condemn Russia and instead opted to call for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. The economic sanctions, while severely damaging to the Russian economy, would still not change its stance, and in fact, as seen in the current wave of Western sanctions, might even prove equally harmful to European countries in particular. Germany, for example, has a strong dependence on Russian gas, a fact that has given more leverage to Russia and has also been a factor in European sanctions being less severe. Putin would also continue to rely on other allies for economic support in light of Western alienation, as he's continued to do so during the current escalation of his war against Ukraine. However, it remains to be seen how long he can continue to sustain his country's economy as the war keeps dragging on. Now, there are many reasons why Putin decided to annex the Crimean Peninsula, but these are mostly strategic, economic, and political. On the strategic side, Russia had maintained some military bases as well as personnel in Crimea even after Ukraine's independence in 1991, most importantly in Sevastopol. Crimea also placed Russia closer to Syria, which proved key when Putin supported Bashar al-Assad's regime during the 2015 Syrian civil war. Even more importantly, Russia has now been using Crimea as a base from which to attack key targets within mainland Ukraine, and it can essentially use the peninsula as an additional front line in its current war against Ukraine. On the economic side, Crimea gives Russia access to key routes in the South Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Additionally, Crimea also possesses key energy supplies, particularly large amounts of oil and gas reserves off the shore of the Black Sea, And of course, on the political side, Putin had reasons to take over Crimea, mainly to reduce Ukraine's prospects of becoming closer to the EU and NATO, which Putin saw as a threat to Russia's influence in the region. After the Cold War, Russia saw Ukraine and Belarus as sort of buffer states between Russia and the European Union, and losing influence in Ukraine risked losing part of that buffer. He used excuses such as the fact that a large portion of its population is ethnically Russian or Russian-speaking, so Putin could use the argument of protecting the Russians of Crimea by bringing them back to the motherland. This relatively bloodless acquisition of Ukrainian territory gave rise to pro-Russian separatist groups in eastern Ukraine, particularly in the Donbas region, which has proven to be a key strategic region in the current phase of the war, following Putin's full-on invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. In the 8 years between Putin's annexation of Crimea and his invasion of Ukraine, separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk, both considered part of the cultural Donbas region, continued to fight against the Ukrainian government, and even went on to proclaim independence at some point. All the while, Putin denied any involvement as of yet, just like he initially did in the beginning of the Crimean takeover. The problem was that during this period between late 2014 and 2022, the Russo-Ukrainian war faded away from Western media. And it wasn't until Putin decided to invade in February 2022 that this years-long conflict came back into the spotlight with an intensified escalation. Another important issue is the lack of severity of the initial international response to the annexation. And despite strained relations between Russia and the West, during the 8-year period between Crimean annexation and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia was still able to conduct military operations within Crimea and to begin preparations for the eventual broader invasion. Additionally, Russia has not yet been fully isolated from the West and was even able to host major international events, such as the FIFA World Cup in 2018. The weak international response signaled an alarming sensation that Putin could get away with almost anything he did, and he would now be tempted to further test the limits of NATO and the West in general, which he has long been doing for the past 2.5 years. Even now, the current fighting in Ukraine has no longer been as prominent in the media, with other conflicts such as the Gaza War and the overall escalation of conflicts in the Middle East now taking the spotlight. The situation remains more vulnerable for Eastern European Union member states that lie within Russia's shadow, being former Soviet republics, and are now even more vulnerable to potential Russian aggression, especially if Putin achieves some form of victory in Ukraine. Putin has a way of twisting history in order to justify his regime's expansion, and he's used this nationalist rhetoric to justify military aggression, not just in Crimea and Ukraine in general, but also in Georgia, and could potentially expand that to countries like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. For these three latter countries, pro-Russian neighbors such as Belarus could potentially facilitate that intervention. Since 2014, or arguably since he entered power nearly 25 years ago, Vladimir Putin has been shaping up the geopolitical order in subtle and not-so-subtle ways. He's brought back the idea of great power expansion and territorial annexation that we thought was part of history now, and with little to no severe consequences. In the highly interconnected and globalized world in which we now live, having a powerful nuclear-armed country conduct itself in such a manner is very dangerous for global peace and stability. This would also send the wrong message to other aspiring authoritarians across the world, such as China's Xi Jinping and his ambitions to reintegrate Taiwan into the People's Republic of China, that there will be no significant consequences to aggressive behavior towards your neighbors. The important thing to take away, though, is that even now, during peace talks and negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, Crimea remains a key point. During the current phase of the war, Russia has even made a precondition to end its current invasion for Ukraine to recognize Russian sovereignty over Crimea. On the other hand, Ukraine has made a larger point of reclaiming Crimea as part of its war goals in response to the Russian invasion of 2022. Zelensky might now not settle for anything less than reclaiming all occupied territory from Russia, including Crimea. And Putin will certainly not settle for any agreement that might involve returning Crimea to the Ukrainians. This renewed spotlight on the peninsula could make any peace arrangements less feasible, and the longer the war drags on, the less likely it'll be for any party to reach their most desirable objectives. Disagreements over Crimea continue to stumble on any progress towards peace. It seems that despite any developments across the other theaters of the Russo-Ukrainian war, like Volodymyr Zelensky once stated, This began with Crimea, and it's likely to end with Crimea. The greatest threat to Russia isn't NATO. It's not economic sanctions, and it's not even the war in Ukraine. It's something much quieter but far more dangerous: Russia's own population collapse. Surprising as it may seem, the Russian government has known about this problem for decades. They've tried all sorts of strategies to turn things around, but none have really made a difference. Back in 2006, Vladimir Putin himself called the demographic crisis Russia's most urgent issue, and even urged Russian women to have more children and focus on starting families. But fast forward 20 years later, and despite those efforts, little has changed, except that the situation has only gotten worse. In this video, we're going to take a look at Russia's demographic crisis. We'll break down what's happening, why it's happening, and what it could mean for Russia's future. From the plummeting birth rates and mass immigration to the effects of the ongoing war, we'll explore why this challenge might be Russia's toughest yet, one with consequences that could reach far beyond its borders. And believe it or not, alcohol, particularly vodka, might be playing a bigger role in Russia's decline than you think. We'll dig into that in a minute, but first, let's look at where things stand today. Before that, be sure to hit the like button below. Any video criticizing Putin has a chance of getting downvoted by Putin's bots to kill its reach in the algorithm, so you can help us fight that. Let's begin. Right now, Russia's fertility rate is hovering around 1.5 births per woman. To put that into perspective, a stable population needs a fertility rate of about 2.1. 2 births to replace mom and dad, and the extra 0.1% is crucial because it accounts for those who might not make it to adulthood. Anything below this number means that over time, a country's population starts shrinking, and for Russia, that's exactly what's happening. A declining population means fewer people entering the workforce. As fewer children are born each year, the number of young people entering the job market begins to decline. This isn't just a problem for businesses looking to hire, but it's also a systematic issue that affects the entire economy. With fewer working-age people, the pressure on those still in the workforce grows significantly. They're not only supporting themselves, but also an increasing number of retirees who depend on pensions and healthcare services. As the population ages and more people leave the workforce, the strain on those social support systems only gets heavier. A shrinking workforce means fewer taxpayers, which translates to less revenue flowing into the government's coffers. This becomes a major problem when it comes to funding essential services like pensions, healthcare, and education. When the government struggles to maintain these programs, people start to feel more financially insecure, and that insecurity often has a direct effect on birth rates. When the future feels uncertain, jobs are hard to come by, wages aren't growing, and living costs keep climbing, people tend to postpone starting families or decide to have fewer kids. It creates a vicious cycle where economic stress and low birth rates feed into each other, making the situation even harder to fix. This demographic problem becomes even more striking when you think about how big the country is. Russia's absolutely massive, stretching over 17 million square kilometers, making it the biggest country in the world. It covers 11 different time zones, reaching from Europe all the way to the Pacific Ocean. To give you an idea of how huge it is, you could take the entire United States or China, fit them within Russia's borders, and there would still be room to spare, almost half of the space left over. Yet, despite its massive size, Russia's population is only about 143 million people as of 2024. Now, 143 million might sound like a lot, but once you start comparing, you realize just how small that number really is. Take Bangladesh, for example. It's a country that's over 116 times smaller than Russia, but it's packed with more than 170 million people. That means that Bangladesh has almost 30 million more people than Russia, squeezed into a much smaller space. And it's not just Bangladesh. Look at Japan, 125 million people living in 377,000 square kilometers. Russia's about 45 times bigger than Japan in terms of land area, yet Japan's population is not that far behind. So even though Russia is a massive country, it doesn't have a massive population to match. These are just 2 examples, and there are many more. At least now you know just how unique and challenging Russia's demographic situation is. Just think about Siberia and the Russian Far East. Combined, these regions cover over 10 million square kilometers, which is more than the entire land area of the United States. Yet the whole Far Eastern Federal District has fewer than 8 million residents. That's less than a city like New York or London. Now, you might wonder why these regions are so empty. Well, a big reason is that after the Soviet Union fell apart in the 1990s, the government couldn't keep supporting these far-flung regions the way they used to. Back in the Soviet days, there was this big push to develop Siberia and the Russian Far East. They sent miners, industrial workers, and their families out there with promises of jobs and decent living standards. Places like Chukotka, Matagan, and Kamchatka were buzzing with activity. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, so did the funding. The industries were shut down, and the people who had moved east started to head back west. They packed up and left for Moscow, St. Petersburg, or just left Russia altogether, looking for better opportunities. As a result, a lot of these towns have been left practically deserted. Some of them are now on the brink of becoming ghost towns. It's kind of like those old Wild West towns in the US that thrived during a gold rush and then just disappeared when the gold dried up. But in Russia, it's on a much bigger scale. Take Norilsk, for example, one of the largest cities in the Arctic. It's way up in northern Siberia and is known for being a big player in nickel mining. The city is still economically important, but its population has completely flatlined. The younger generation isn't sticking around anymore. Instead, they're leaving for places like Moscow, where they think there's more opportunity and a better quality of life. And honestly, who can blame them? Living in a remote, freezing place like Norilsk isn't exactly everyone's dream. This same story repeats in Khabarovsk and Vladivostok, further down in the Russian Far East. These places have history, culture, and natural beauty, but the younger folks often leave. They head off to European Russia, where things are a bit more connected and modern, or they even leave the country entirely, seeking better prospects abroad. And here's the thing. It's not just about personal choices or economic reasons. It's also about the impact this has on the country as a whole. When people leave these remote regions, it makes it harder for Russia to maintain its presence and influence in those areas. Places like Siberia and the Russian Far East are incredibly rich in natural resources like oil, gas, minerals, you name it. But with fewer people living there, it becomes tougher to develop these areas and keep the local economy going. On top of that, the harsh climate of these regions plays a huge role too. It's tough to convince people to live in a place where winters last most of the year and the nearest major city is 1,000 kilometers away. Without enough people, it's hard for these areas to develop the infrastructure they need, like schools, hospitals, and modern amenities. It creates a vicious cycle. People leave because life is tough, and life stays tough because there aren't enough people. But if we look at the other end of the spectrum, Moscow tells a different story. While much of Russia's hinterlands struggle with depopulation, Moscow is growing. It's now home to over 13 million people, with the wider metropolitan area reaching nearly 21.5 million. This makes Moscow not only the largest city in Russia, but also one of the largest in Europe. St. Petersburg has also seen growth, though on a smaller scale, rising from 4.7 million in 2002 to about 5.6 million today. So when you put all this together, you can start to see why Russia's demographic issue is such a big deal. The country has this enormous amount of land, but it's struggling to keep its population spread out across it. Sure, Moscow and St. Petersburg are bustling hubs with millions of residents, but the farther you go from these cities, the emptier things get. And in a country like Russia, that can have serious implications, not just for the economy, but for things like national security and regional stability too. But how did it get this bad? To really understand this, we have to go back in time. Way back, to the early days of the 20th century. The roots of Russia's demographic issues run deep, all the way through revolutions, Stalin's brutal purges, and the devastating patriotic war that left a lasting impact on the population. You see, it all started with the revolutions of the early 1900s. The Russian Empire, which had ruled for centuries, came crashing down in 1917 during the Russian Revolution. That year, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, overthrew the monarchy and established the Soviet Union. But the transition wasn't smooth. Far from it. The Bolshevik takeover plunged the country into a brutal civil war that would last from 1917 to 1923, pitting the Bolshevik Red Army against the anti-Bolshevik White Army, which included various factions, monarchists, and foreign intervention forces. This conflict was not confined to battlefields. It swept through cities, towns, and rural areas, tearing apart the social fabric of the country. The Russian Civil War resulted in millions of deaths. Estimates vary, but it's believed that between 7 to 12 million people died due to combat, famine, and disease. The fighting itself claimed the lives of around 2 to 3 million. Entire towns were caught in the crossfire, and atrocities were committed on both sides, leading to a level of brutality that devastated the civilian population. But perhaps even more destructive than the fighting was the famine that struck during this period. With the chaos of war, agriculture production collapsed. Farmers were often caught between the Red and White armies, and their crops and livestock were seized or destroyed. The resulting food shortages led to widespread famine. It's estimated that around 5 million people died of starvation, with entire villages succumbing to hunger. Regions like the Volga Basin in Ukraine were hit particularly hard, with people resorting to eating whatever they could find, like roots and grass. On top of that, epidemics of typhus, cholera, and influenza swept through the population, taking advantage of malnutrition and poor living conditions. The population of the Russian Empire was around 170 million before World War I, but by the end of the Civil War, it had dropped significantly, with estimates suggesting a loss of around 10 to 12 million people in just a few short years. This loss was not just a matter of numbers. It meant that entire generations were decimated, leaving behind a population that was physically weakened. The Civil War also caused mass displacement. As battles raged across the country, millions of people fled their homes, either to escape the fighting or to search for food and safety. Many fled to neighboring countries, creating a massive refugee crisis in Eastern Europe. Some never returned, leaving behind ghost towns and abandoned farms. Families were separated, with children often left orphaned and communities shattered. The displacement didn't just mean that people were moving. It meant that entire communities were being uprooted and destroyed, taking with them the cultural and social ties that had held them together for generations. The loss of millions of people, especially young men, during the Civil War and the associated crises meant that the birth rate took a hit. Beyond the obvious losses of life and displacement, there was a psychological toll that affected the survivors. The trauma of witnessing family members die, of facing starvation, and of seeing one's home destroyed left many with a sense of disillusionment and bitterness. This collective trauma would shape Soviet society in the years that followed, creating a population that was both resilient and scarred by the hardships they'd endured. But the story didn't end there. After the Civil War, the Soviet Union was born, and a new chapter began. The Soviet government, once it had secured power, made efforts to rebuild and reshape the country, but the demographic imbalance was hard to ignore. Joseph Stalin believed that for the Soviet Union to survive and compete with Western powers, it needed to industrialize rapidly. He saw industrialization not just as a path to economic strength, but as a way to cement his control over the country. To achieve this, he launched a series of aggressive policies that included the 5-year plans, beginning in 1928. These plans aimed to speed up the development of heavy industries like steel production, coal mining, and machinery. To fuel this industrial push, the Soviet Union needed resources, manpower, and, crucially, food to support its growing urban workforce. And that's where collectivization came in, a policy that would change the lives of millions of Soviet citizens, especially those in rural areas. Collectivization meant taking away privately owned farms and consolidating them into large state-run collective farms, known as kolkhozes or sovkhozes. The Soviet government argued that this would modernize agriculture, increase food production, and free up labor for factories. But in practice, it was a brutal process that met with widespread resistance. Many farmers, or kulaks as the Soviet propaganda labeled them, didn't want to give up their land, their way of life, or the small measure of independence they'd managed to hold on to. In response, Stalin's regime came down hard. Those who resisted were labeled as enemies of the state and faced harsh punishments. Entire families were branded as kulaks and sent to the Gulag, Soviet prison camps scattered across the remote and freezing reaches of Siberia, the Urals, and Kazakhstan. These camps were notorious for their brutal conditions. Prisoners were forced into hard labor in extreme climates, building railways, mining, or logging, with barely enough food to survive. The death toll in the gulags was staggering. It's estimated that between 1.5 to 2 million people died in these camps during the 1930s alone, succumbing to starvation, disease, and exhaustion. But it wasn't just those sent to the Gulag who suffered. The process of collectivization itself unleashed chaos across the Soviet countryside. Farmers who had their land and livestock seized faced the prospect of starvation. Livestock numbers plummeted as desperate peasants slaughtered their animals rather than handing them over to the state. The agricultural disruption caused by this mass upheaval led to severe food shortages, and what followed was one of the darkest chapters in Soviet history, the Holodomor. The Holodomor, which means death by hunger in Ukrainian, took place from 1932 to 1933. It was a man-made famine, driven by Stalin's policies and the forced requisition of grain from the Ukrainian countryside. The Soviet government took the food that Ukrainian farmers produced, often leaving them with nothing to eat. The grain was sold abroad to fund industrial projects, while millions of people back home starved. Estimates suggest that around 3.5 to 7 million people died during the Holodomor. Entire villages were wiped out, and the scenes of suffering were unimaginable. Again, people resorted to eating grass and leaves, and some even resorted to cannibalism in their desperation. The demographic impact of Stalin's policies during this time is hard to overstate. Estimates indicate that the rural birth rate dropped by more than 50% during the peak of the famine. In some areas, it fell to as low as 15 to 20 births per 1,000 people. Families struggling to survive simply couldn't afford to have more children. Communities that had once been tight-knit and self-sufficient were fractured. Their cultural traditions disrupted as people were moved to collective farms or deported to distant regions. The shift of labor from the countryside to the city may have fueled industrial growth, but it left a hollowed-out countryside behind. The forced industrialization did achieve some of its goals. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union had built up a significant industrial base. The country was producing more steel, oil, and machinery than ever before, and Stalin boasted that the USSR had caught up with the West. But these achievements came at a terrible cost. The millions who died of starvation, the families torn apart by the Gulag, and the villages that vanished from the map left deep demographic holes that couldn't easily be filled. And then came the purges. From 1936 to 1938, Stalin unleashed what's known as the Great Purge or the Great Terror. During this time, he targeted anyone he considered a threat to his power: political rivals, intellectuals, military officers, and even ordinary citizens. Hundreds of thousands were executed, and millions more were imprisoned in the gulags. But as devastating as the purges were, the most severe blow to Russia's population came during World War II. For Russia, this wasn't just World War II, it was the Great Patriotic War. According to Russians, the Great Patriotic War began on June 22, 1941, when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. The Nazis aimed to conquer the Soviet Union quickly, believing that a swift victory would crush the Soviet regime. But the Soviet Union was determined to fight back, and what followed was a brutal 4-year struggle for survival that engulfed nearly every part of the country. For the Soviet people, this wasn't just a war, it was a fight for their homes, their families, and their very existence. More than 1,700 towns and some 70,000 villages had been all but wiped off the map, along with around 32,000 factories and 65,000 kilometers of railway track. Plus, the human toll of this war was unimaginable. By the time it ended in 1945, over 27 million Soviet citizens had lost their lives. This staggering number includes roughly 8 to 11 million soldiers who fought in some of the war's most brutal battles, like Stalingrad and Kursk. But the devastation didn't stop with the military losses. Millions of Soviet civilians were also caught in the crossfire or directly targeted by Nazi forces. Entire towns and villages were erased from the map, and cities turned into war zones. For many, the war was nothing short of a living nightmare. Reports suggest that around 18.5 million Soviet citizens died throughout World War II. To put this into perspective, the United States suffered about 300,000 combat deaths and 400,000 total deaths during the war. This means that the Soviet Union endured 67 times as many losses as the United States in World War II. One of the most harrowing chapters of World War II was the Siege of Leningrad, a city that endured nearly 900 days of relentless bombardment and blockade by Nazi forces. From September 1941 to January 1944, Leningrad was cut off from supplies and surrounded by German troops who sought to starve the city into submission. With supply lines severed, food in Leningrad became a rare and precious commodity. Rations plummeted to just 125 grams of bread per person per day during the worst periods of the siege, and even then, the bread was often mixed with sawdust to make it last longer. The desperation drove people to extreme measures, like boiling leather belts, shoes, and even wallpaper paste in a desperate attempt to extract any bit of nutrition they could. The war left a profound mark on Russia's demographics. In fact, if you look at the population pyramid of the Russian Federation today, you can still see the echo of World War II moving through their society. A population pyramid typically reflects the distribution of different age groups in a society. In healthy growing populations, it resembles a true pyramid. Growing populations have more youth at the bottom than aging people at the top. Stable populations look like pillars. Russia's pyramid looks like a choppy and uneven wave. That's because every 30 years, the generation connected to World War II produces far fewer people than the generations around them. More than 27 million Soviet citizens lost their lives during the war, people who might have married, had children, and kept the cycle of life going. Instead, many of them died on the front lines, in sieges, or under Nazi occupation. With so many lives lost, there simply weren't enough people left to start new families once the war was over. This drop in birth rates didn't just disappear, it left a lasting mark on Russia's demographics. It's like a ripple effect that stretches across time. Every 30 years or so, the impact of those losses resurfaces as each smaller generation leads to another, continuing the cycle of population decline. World War II killed roughly 14% of the Russian population. Unless the couples in the generations connected to World War II decided to have 4 to 6 children each, there was no way for the Soviet Union to correct the loss that was suffered between 1941 and 1945. Unfortunately, the trauma of the war left many survivors focused on simply trying to rebuild their lives, with little energy left for starting families. It's hard to think about starting a family when you're surrounded by the physical reminders of war. Ruined buildings, mass graves, and vast empty spaces where whole villages once stood. For many, the focus was on putting one foot in front of the other, not on raising children. Despite all this, Stalin pushed forward with rebuilding efforts, demanding even more sacrifices from the population. The Soviet government poured resources into reconstruction, but the process took years. By the 1950s, there was a brief moment of hope with a baby boom. The Soviet Union's total population grew from about 170 million in 1946 to roughly 200 million by 1956. This growth reflected the high birth rates, with around 2.5 to 3 million births each year in the early 1950s. The Soviet government actively encouraged families to have more children, trying to rebuild from the devastation of the war. But even with this surge, they could never fully replace the millions of lives lost between 1941 and 1945. The psychological impact of the war made many hesitant to have large families. After all, they'd seen firsthand how fragile life could be. Fast forward to the 1970s and 1980s, and the Soviet Union was starting to stagnate. The initial optimism of the post-war years started to fade, and the economy began to struggle. Factories built during the era of rapid industrialization became outdated, and the planned economy couldn't keep up with the needs of a modern society. The healthcare system, which had once been a point of pride, started to crumble under the weight of these challenges. Infant mortality rates rose, and life expectancy began to decline. The population, which had grown briefly in the post-war years, now faced new pressures and started dropping again. Then came the 1980s, and with it a new crisis: alcoholism. Vodka was not only cheap and easily accessible, but it was also ingrained in the very fabric of Russian society. The combination of economic struggles and the cultural normalization of heavy drinking caused alcohol consumption to soar, leading to a staggering rise in alcohol-related illnesses and deaths. This directly contributed to the country's worsening demographic decline. Men in particular were hit hard, with skyrocketing rates of alcohol-related diseases like cirrhosis of the liver, heart disease, and alcohol poisoning. In some regions, men's life expectancy plummeted to shockingly low levels, with many dying in their 50s or even earlier. By the late 1980s, the average life expectancy for men in Russia had dropped to just 63 years, a decline that paralleled the rise in alcohol consumption. To put this into perspective, in certain parts of the Soviet Union, men were dying at rates typically seen in war zones, not in peacetime nations. In regions like the Russian Far East and Siberia, male life expectancy sank even further, as low as the mid-50s. But to be fair, this wasn't a new problem. Russians had been drinking themselves into early graves long before the Soviet Union existed, going back as far as the days of the ancient Tsars. For centuries, alcohol had been the most common escape for the average Russian citizen, a way to numb the pain of harsh winters, political oppression, and economic instability. During the Soviet era, alcohol was often used as a coping mechanism to endure the grinding realities of life under the regime. Even today, the situation in Russia remains grim. Sure, there's a war going on, but outside of that, there's plenty of food, no widespread famine, and none of the extreme hardships you might expect from a failed state. Yet despite this, the average teenage boy in Russia today still has a lower chance of living to the age of 65 than boys in some of the world's poorest and most war-torn countries, like Somalia or Ethiopia. Even in 2021, before the war, the life expectancy for Russian men was just 67 years, still shockingly low by global standards. So the only difference is that the Russian population has vodka. It might surprise you to learn that, on average, Russians consume a staggering 18 liters of pure alcohol per person each year. To put that into context, that's more than double the maximum amount deemed safe by the World Health Organization, which recommends no more than 8 liters per year. Excessive drinking in Russia has remained one of the country's biggest killers, contributing to as much as 30% of all deaths in the country. Even in times of relative peace and economic stability, Russia's deep-rooted alcohol problem remains one of the biggest factors driving its demographic crisis. And as I mentioned earlier, this is not a new issue. Alcohol has plagued Russian society since the mid-16th century, ever since Ivan the Terrible legalized the sale of vodka as a state-controlled enterprise to raise revenue. From then on, vodka's fueled countless personal tragedies and, on a larger scale, contributed to the decline of an entire nation. From church ceremonies and religious festivals to weddings, political functions, and even business transactions, vodka was the beverage of choice. It was customary, expected, and in many cases, seen as almost obligatory. No significant gathering in Russian society was complete without the clinking of glasses and the familiar burn of vodka. It wasn't just a social lubricant, but also widely believed to possess medicinal qualities. In fact, many Russians used vodka as an antiseptic, an anesthetic, and a treatment for various ailments. If a family member fell ill, a shot of vodka was seen as the remedy. If there was a cause for celebration, vodka was the first thing poured. Church events in particular played a significant role in the ritualized consumption of vodka. It was common at baptisms, funerals, and other religious ceremonies, further embedding alcohol into the cultural and spiritual life of Russians. The church's acceptance of vodka at these events only strengthened its position in society, making it an ever-present element of Russian life. In many ways, vodka wasn't just a drink. It was a tradition, a solution to both sorrow and joy, and a tool for social bonding. Soon, the Russian Tsars recognized the cultural importance of vodka and established a sophisticated system to heavily capitalize. So, over the course of 400 years, they not only controlled the entire vodka market, but also used it as a major source of revenue. By regulating production and distribution, they determined the price of vodka, and in doing so, ensured it was cheap and widely available. The Tsars knew that keeping the population supplied with an endless flow of inexpensive vodka was a means of control. The system established by the Tsars over the course of the next 400 years did more than just foster a cultural dependence on vodka. It became a sophisticated revenue-generating machine. The state controlled the entire vodka market, dictating production and setting prices, ensuring that vodka was not only cheap, but also widely available to the masses. The idea was simple. By keeping the population drunk on a constant supply of cheap vodka, the Tsars maintained control over the people. Vodka was, in many ways, a tool of governance. This tactic was particularly effective among the peasants, who often spent what little money they had on vodka. After a few drinks, they were too drunk to think critically about their dire circumstances, too drunk to question why he was living in poverty or how he might improve his lot in life, too drunk to organize or participate in any kind of protest or rebellion. The Tsarist regime understood that a population numbed by alcohol was far less likely to challenge their rule. And so, the vodka monopoly became a cornerstone of the Russian state's control over its citizens. Social events, especially in rural areas, were marked by marathon drinking sessions that often lasted for days. Peasants would attend communal parties, weddings, and religious festivals that seemed never-ending, and with each passing hour came more rounds of vodka. Weddings in particular became notorious for the sheer volume of alcohol consumed. The bride and groom would typically provide 6 to 8 vedros of vodka. That's around 75 to 100 liters, all of which would be consumed before the wedding ceremony even began. At the wedding itself, the bride's family could easily spend up to 200 rubles on vodka alone. To put that in perspective, this was an enormous sum of money, especially for a peasant family. For a poorer family, it could represent months or even an entire year's worth of savings, all spent in one go. This excessive spending on vodka at social gatherings wasn't seen as reckless, but rather it was expected. A social obligation to show respect and ensure the event was properly celebrated. The fact that families would willingly go into debt to provide such quantities of vodka shows just how integral the drink was to Russian peasant life. Vodka also played a major role in countless social and religious events. It's estimated that Orthodox feast days claimed more than 1/3 of the year. That's over 120 days devoted to religious observance, and of course, drinking. As if that weren't enough, they found even more reasons to drink on non-religious occasions. Take, for example, the concept of pomoch. In Russian, pomoch means help, and it referred to one of the major social events in rural Russia, particularly in the countryside. Whenever a peasant found themselves needing extra hands for any kind of task, whether it was harvesting crops, building a barn, or even household chores, they would call for a pomoch. Essentially, this was a work party where friends, families, and neighbors would come together to lend a hand. But here's where things take a strange turn. The workers weren't paid with money. Instead, it was tradition for the host family to pay their helpers in food, and more importantly, vodka. And it wasn't just a small gesture. Providing vodka was considered a key part of hospitality. Before long, these gatherings shifted from being about getting the work done to being more about the drinking itself. Work that could have been completed in a day or two would stretch out for several as the workers became too intoxicated to continue after the first few hours. Instead of helping the community, these events often left people with little to show for their efforts, other than a headache and an empty bottle. So people began to turn to the village youth for help, but that quickly backfired. The pomoch, which was supposed to be about working together, soon became the young people's first introduction to drinking. Even among the youth, the line between work and drinking began to blur, and what started as a tradition of helping out became more of an excuse to indulge in heavy drinking. It's easy to see how the Russian peasantry, and by extension the local economy, was digging its own grave through alcoholism. But the problem didn't stop there. This culture of excessive drinking soon seeped into the national economy as well, especially when alcohol made its way into the workplace. Just as the pomoch tradition encouraged communal drinking in rural areas, there was another term in Russian workplaces, privalno. This was a welcoming ceremony for a new worker joining the team, and as you might guess, it involved vodka, along with some snacks. It wasn't just a casual party to break the ice, but it was an essential part of the onboarding process that solidified the bond between the worker and his colleagues. New hires were expected to drink on their very first day, even while receiving important instructions about their role. It wasn't uncommon for new employees to be so intoxicated that they hardly remembered the tasks they were supposed to learn. This practice turned what should have been a productive and informative first day into a chaotic and unprofessional mess. And it didn't just stop at the first day. Over time, this ceremony evolved into an unwritten rule in many Russian workplaces. Newly hired or newly promoted workers were expected to treat their colleagues to drinks and snacks. If they refused, they risked more than just a bad first impression. They might never acquire the skills they needed to do their job. You see, this wasn't just about drinking, it was about fitting in. If a new worker didn't provide the customary drinks, there was a good chance that his coworkers could intentionally withhold training or support. In some cases, the new hire could be ostracized completely, facing ridicule, name-calling, or even social isolation. It was in the worker's best interest to comply with this tradition, or risk being shut out by his peers. This ritual wasn't just a minor expenditure either. For many workers, it was a serious financial burden. The cost of treating fellow workers to vodka and snacks could range from 200 to 300 rubles, equivalent to several days' wages. And in some cases, workers were forced to spend as much as 800 rubles on a single drinking session. Imagine sacrificing a week's worth of pay just to buy alcohol for your colleagues. The impact of this tradition on the workforce was devastating. For a nation already struggling with productivity and industrial output, the widespread drinking in workplaces led to frequent accidents, injuries, and even fires. Factories in particular became hotspots for alcohol-fueled disasters. Workers who were intoxicated on the job were more prone to mistakes, mishandling equipment, or ignoring safety protocols. This led to frequent accidents, some of which were fatal. So naturally, the culture of drinking led to a general reduction in productivity across many sectors. Workers simply couldn't perform at their best while under the influence, and this had a direct impact on the efficiency of the national economy. By the 1920s, when the communists took control of Russia, the new regime quickly realized that the country's rampant alcohol problem was having a disastrous effect on productivity. The Soviet leadership decided that something had to be done about it. They understood that the country couldn't afford to have its labor force bogged down by drunkenness, especially as they embarked on a massive industrialization campaign. To address this, the Soviet government instituted strict measures to curb alcohol consumption in the workplace. One of their main strategies was to place guards at factory entrances. These guards were tasked with preventing workers from bringing alcohol into the workplace and ensuring that laborers showed up sober. On paper, this seemed like a reasonable solution. After all, a disciplined and sober workforce was critical for achieving the Soviets' ambitious industrial goals. However, in practice, these measures were far less effective than the regime had hoped. While some workers did modify their drinking habits, the deeply ingrained tradition of consuming vodka was hard to break. Laborers found creative ways to sneak alcohol into the factory, often hiding it in personal belongings or stashing bottles in various nooks and crannies around the workplace. Despite the presence of guards, vodka still made its way into the very spaces the government sought to keep alcohol free. The inefficacy of these measures highlighted how deeply entrenched alcohol was in Russian culture, even in the face of strict governmental control. It eventually became a cat-and-mouse game, with workers finding new ways to outwit the guards and continue their drinking traditions. Before the Communist Revolution, hiring practices were largely informal and based on personal connections. Workers were often hired upon the recommendation of an acquaintance, and this came with its own set of unwritten obligations. The newcomer was expected to throw a vodka party for his fellow workers as a way of clearing his debt for being introduced to the job. This created a cycle where new employees had to start their working lives by spending their hard-earned wages on alcohol for their colleagues. However, when the communists came to power, they reformed these hiring practices. The new government believed in a more meritocratic system, where workers were selected based on their skills and qualifications rather than personal connections. They eliminated the expectation that a new worker had to throw a party to repay those who recommended them. Additionally, the Soviets established trade schools run by trade unions, where new workers could receive formal training before entering the workforce. This eliminated the need for veteran workers to train new recruits on the job, reducing the reliance on informal systems of mentorship that were often tied to the consumption of alcohol. By formalizing the training process, the Soviets hoped to create a more professional and productive workforce, free from the distractions of workplace drinking. Yet, despite these reforms, the tradition of privolnaya persisted for decades. It became less about repaying a debt and more about maintaining a long-standing tradition that was hard to shake, despite the government's best efforts. The exact same issue of alcohol consumption and dependence extended into the military, where vodka became a staple not just for celebrations, but as a tool to keep soldiers in check. You might be surprised to learn that there was once a regular vodka ration system in place for both sailors and soldiers, a practice that lasted for many decades. Many in the military considered vodka to be essential, not only for lifting spirits during long and grueling deployments, but also as a means of maintaining morale in the harshest conditions. Whether stationed at the front lines, on naval ships, or in remote military outposts, soldiers were often issued vodka as part of their daily rations. From the early days of Imperial Russia through the Soviet era, commanders believed that alcohol could help manage the stress and fear that came with military life. In World War II, for example, Soviet soldiers were given a daily ration of 100 grams of vodka, referred to as commissar's rations, especially in times of intense fighting. This was believed to boost morale and dull the soldiers' fear before heading into battle. However, as you can imagine, the regular consumption of vodka had serious consequences on the troops' behavior and discipline. Vodka not only impaired soldiers' behavior, but it also encouraged a culture of heavy drinking within the ranks. The more soldiers drank, the more likely they were to engage in disorderly conduct. Drunkenness became a widespread issue, leading to a significant rise in misconduct, including insubordination, theft, and violence. And the problems escalated even further when rations were reduced. When the military authorities attempted to cut down on the amount of vodka distributed, it didn't solve the problem, it made it worse. Soldiers began smuggling vodka into the barracks, finding creative ways to hide their alcohol from commanding officers. This only made matters worse. Instead of moderating their consumption, soldiers resorted to secret drinking, often consuming even more than they had before. The result was an increase in drunkenness, disorder, and a spike in criminal behavior among the troops. Barracks that were already difficult to manage became nearly ungovernable, with fights, accidents, and even desertions on the rise. This created a vicious cycle, especially for new recruits. Upon joining the military, young soldiers were quickly introduced to the drinking culture by their more experienced comrades. Like I've said many times before, it wasn't just expected that they would drink, it was practically mandatory. Refusing to drink with your fellow soldiers wasn't just frowned upon, it was seen as an insult. In the tightly knit bonds of military brotherhood, sharing vodka was a way of camaraderie, to prove that you were one of the group. For a new recruit, there was little room to resist the pressure. The expectation to drink with fellow soldiers was so deeply ingrained that failure to do so could lead to social isolation, ridicule, or worse. Many young soldiers had no real choice. They were introduced to alcohol from the moment they arrived, often at their first welcoming ceremony, and it became part of their daily routine. Over time, this led to a troubling cycle. New recruits, eager to fit in and be accepted, would adopt the same drinking habits as their more seasoned comrades. And as they continued down this path, many found themselves becoming alcoholics, trapped in a destructive cycle of dependence that followed them throughout their military careers and often beyond. In 1878, a commanding officer named Butovsky began a detailed investigation into the behavior of new recruits during their first 5 years in military service. His goal was to track the evolution of alcohol consumption among the recruits, from the moment they entered the service until the end of their first enlistment. What he uncovered was alarming evidence and statistics that highlighted the growing issue of alcoholism within the Russian military. According to Butovsky's findings, when recruits first joined the military, 43% of them refused their vodka ration. A surprising statistic that indicated not all recruits were immediately drawn to alcohol. At the same time, about 10% of recruits drank more than their allocated ration, showing early signs of excessive drinking. But over the course of just 1 year, these numbers changed dramatically. A year into their service, only 17% of the recruits were still refusing their vodka rations, while 27% had not only started drinking the rations, but were also consuming extra vodka on the side. Fast forward to 1883, and the situation had worsened considerably. Butovsky's study showed that by this point, only 7% of recruits were abstaining from their vodka ration. Shockingly, more than half of the soldiers were now drinking beyond the rations, consuming additional vodka in secret. Butovsky also noted that the 7% of soldiers who resisted drinking were subjected to heavy bullying and derogatory name-calling by their comrades. Non-drinkers were mockingly referred to as old women or dawdler, highlighting the toxic environment that pressured recruits into joining the drinking culture. By the 1890s, the consequences of this drinking culture became impossible to ignore. Reports of alcohol-related incidents like fights, accidents, and disciplinary issues became more common and even started drawing public attention to the problem. The devastating effects of alcoholism on soldiers' health and behavior were becoming more visible, and the broader public began to demand action. However, despite growing awareness, there was significant resistance within the military to any attempts at reform. Many officers and military leaders believed that vodka played a crucial role in keeping soldiers happy, particularly in times of long deployments and grueling conditions. Some even argued that alcohol had medicinal benefits, especially in harsh climates or during cold weather, where a shot of vodka was believed to warm the body. Still, the public remained unconvinced, so in response, the Russian Society for the Protection of Public Health stepped in and formed a commission to investigate the growing problem. Influential psychiatrists such as M.N. Nizhigorodtsev took a firm stance on the matter. Nizhigorodtsev advocated for the complete elimination of alcohol from military camps and barracks, proposing instead that soldiers be given a daily tea allowance as a healthier alternative. His solution was to introduce recreational activities for the lower-ranking soldiers, such as sports, games, and social events that could distract them from alcohol. But I guess Nizhigorodtsev underestimated that to most Russians, vodka was like tea. So another doctor, P.V. Pudilov, took a more analytical approach to understanding the scope of the problem. He examined injuries and deaths that were likely linked to alcohol consumption, but often went unreported as such. After reviewing cases between 1890 and 1896, Pudilov concluded that alcohol poisoning was the underlying cause of 75% of all ailments suffered by soldiers admitted to medical facilities during that period. Furthermore, Putilov estimated that between 10 and 44% of all military deaths during that time could be directly linked to alcohol abuse. If Putilov's figures were accurate, and there's little reason to doubt them, it would suggest that alcohol was playing an absolutely devastating role in the military. Instead of addressing the problem head-on, military officials largely ignored Putilov's findings. Rather than see alcohol as a poison eroding the health and discipline of their soldiers, they clung to the outdated belief that alcohol gave soldiers spirit, helping them face the hardships of war. This refusal to take the issue seriously would come back to haunt the Russian military in the most humiliating way during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. The Russo-Japanese War, which was supposed to be a demonstration of Russian military might, quickly turned into a disaster, and alcohol was one of the major reasons for the army's failure. The Russian military command sent immense quantities of alcohol to the front lines, believing it would boost morale and keep soldiers steady under pressure. According to one report, the official plan for August 1904 included 300 poods of vodka for an army of 400,000 soldiers to last for 8 months, with an additional 255,000 poods allocated for the following year. To put that into perspective, 1 pood is equal to 16 kilograms, meaning the army received 4.8 million kilograms of vodka. That's an astonishing 12 kilograms of vodka for each of the 400,000 soldiers. It doesn't take much imagination to understand how disastrous this was. With such quantities of vodka readily available, many soldiers became too drunk to fight effectively. In one particularly harrowing incident, Japanese forces reportedly found several thousand Russian soldiers so dead drunk they were able to bayonet them like livestock without encountering any resistance. These scenes of soldiers incapacitated by alcohol became a symbol of the war's failure and the tragic impact of unchecked alcoholism within the ranks. It was after this catastrophic defeat that the military was finally forced to confront the reality of its alcohol problem. The leadership decided to replace vodka rations with lighter beverages, such as beer or wine, in an effort to curb the debilitating effects of heavy drinking on the troops. But this was more of a temporary measure than a long-term solution. By the time the Russian Revolution of 1917 swept across the nation, the country was on the brink of radical change, and so was the role of vodka. When the Bolsheviks seized power and established the Soviet Union, they initially sought to eliminate alcohol from public life, seeing it as a symbol of the oppression of the Tsarist era. For a brief period, vodka was all but eradicated from public life. The Bolsheviks enforced harsh penalties for alcohol production and distribution, hoping to build a new Soviet citizen free from the vices of the old world. But despite these efforts, the ban was far from successful. The demand for alcohol remained high, and black market distilleries began popping up across the country, producing illegal vodka that was often of poor quality and sometimes dangerous to drink. The state couldn't keep up with the sheer scale of illicit alcohol production, and by the 1920s, it became clear that prohibition wasn't working. Lenin's successor, Joseph Stalin, saw an opportunity. Instead of continuing the fight against alcohol, Stalin's government reintroduced vodka as a state-controlled commodity. In 1924, the Soviet government reintroduced vodka as a legal, state-controlled commodity, and by the 1930s, Stalin's government had fully nationalized the production and sale of alcohol. This marked the beginning of one of the most profitable state monopolies in Soviet history. The Soviet Union took control of all alcohol production, reopening old distilleries and constructing new ones to meet the growing demand. Between 1925 and 1930, dozens of new distilleries were built across the country to ramp up production. By 1934, more than 400 state-owned distilleries were in operation, with many producing vodka on an industrial scale. The Soviet government didn't just control production. It also set fixed prices and maintained strict distribution channels to ensure that vodka sales were monopolized by the state. This control allowed the government to set the price of vodka artificially high, maximizing profits. By 1935, vodka sales were generating massive revenue for the Soviet state. The figures were staggering. Vodka alone accounted for nearly 12% of the Soviet Union's total state revenue. The tax on vodka was a key component of this revenue stream. From the late 1920s through the mid-1930s, alcohol taxes were raised multiple times, ensuring that the state captured an ever-growing share of the profits from alcohol sales. By 1937, the revenue from alcohol taxes accounted for approximately 20 to 25% of the entire state budget, an astonishing figure that illustrates just how central vodka had become to the Soviet economy. In terms of raw numbers, the Soviet Union's alcohol revenues skyrocketed. In 1927, the state collected roughly 500 million rubles from alcohol taxes. By 1930, that figure had doubled to around 1 billion rubles, and by the late 1930s, alcohol revenue had reached approximately 6 to 8 billion rubles annually. This massive influx of money was used to fund Stalin's ambitious 5-year plans, which focused on rapid industrialization and military expansion, as we stated earlier. Vodka production didn't even stop during World War II. In fact, vodka was referred to as liquid currency, as the revenue was used to purchase weapons, build tanks, and sustain military logistics. To give you an even clearer picture, by the late 1930s, vodka consumption in the Soviet Union had reached an estimated 3.5 liters of pure alcohol per capita annually. By World War II, this figure had increased to 5 liters per capita. In addition to the taxes collected from vodka sales, the state also introduced excise taxes on other forms of alcohol, further boosting its revenue. By some estimates, alcohol taxes accounted for up to 30% of the Soviet Union's total tax revenue during the 1930s and early 1940s. But all of this came at a massive cost. While the Soviet economy benefited enormously from alcohol revenue, the social consequences were severe. It was estimated that up to 25 to 30% of all deaths in the Soviet Union were attributable to alcohol consumption. The liver was the first organ to suffer. Chronic alcohol abuse leads to conditions such as fatty liver, alcoholic hepatitis, and ultimately cirrhosis, a condition in which the liver becomes scarred and loses its ability to function properly. Cirrhosis is a slow, painful killer, and by the 1950s, cirrhosis of the liver had become one of the leading causes of death among Soviet men. Soviet health statistics from the late 1950s indicated that alcohol-related liver disease was responsible for nearly 10% of male deaths. Excessive vodka consumption also led to cardiovascular issues. Chronic heavy drinking increases blood pressure, weakens the heart muscle, and contributes to the development of arrhythmias and heart attacks. By the 1960s, cardiovascular diseases caused by heavy drinking became a major health crisis in the Soviet Union. Soviet medical reports from the mid-1960s showed that nearly 15% of all cardiovascular deaths were directly linked to excessive alcohol consumption. Over the next 5 to 10 years, the life expectancy of Soviet men began to drop, falling from 65 years to 63 years. This decline was not only due to alcohol-related deaths, including liver disease and alcohol poisoning, but also from increased accidents and violent crimes committed by drunk Soviets. Soviet mortality rates also skyrocketed during this period. By the late 1970s, Soviet men started dying at an alarming rate. The average male life expectancy dropped to 61. This was significantly lower than in other industrialized nations. In some regions, particularly in Siberia and the Russian Far East, male life expectancy was as low as 55 years. Women, on the other hand, had a much higher life expectancy, averaging around 72 years. But this difference created a sharp demographic imbalance, with far more women than men surviving into old age. On one hand, alcoholism was not only killing off Soviet men at a young age, but it was also contributing to a declining birth rate. Many men of childbearing age were either too sick or too incapacitated by alcohol to start families. The physical and mental toll of long-term alcoholism also led to infertility and impotence in many men. Chronic alcohol abuse was found to impair sperm production, leading to lower sperm quality and quantity, which significantly contributed to male infertility during that era. A study found that around 50% of infertility cases were linked to male factors. In severe cases, alcohol led to hormonal imbalances and damage to the reproductive system, further increasing infertility rates. Over the next decade, alcohol-related deaths more than doubled, with tens of thousands of men dying each year from alcohol poisoning alone. Soviet hospitals were overwhelmed with cases of alcohol-induced liver disease, heart attacks, and alcohol poisoning. By 1980, alcohol was responsible for nearly 20% of all male deaths in the Soviet Union. Cirrhosis of the liver, heart disease, and alcohol poisoning were the 3 leading alcohol-related causes of death. The Soviet leadership, while aware of the problem, found themselves in a difficult position. The state heavily relied on vodka sales for revenue. By 1975, alcohol taxes made up between 15% and 20% of the Soviet budget. Cutting back on vodka production would mean losing billions in revenue. But at the same time, the cost of alcohol-related social and health problems was growing exponentially. So, in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev launched an ambitious anti-alcohol campaign in an attempt to reverse decades of alcohol abuse and its damaging effects on society. The campaign, known as the Dry Law, sought to drastically reduce alcohol consumption by limiting the production and sale of vodka and other spirits. Gorbachev ordered the destruction of vineyards, distilleries, and vodka production facilities. Alcohol sales were restricted to certain hours of the day, and the price of vodka was increased significantly to make it less affordable. Initially, the campaign appeared to be successful. Alcohol consumption dropped by nearly 50% between 1985 and 1987, and alcohol-related deaths fell sharply. Male life expectancy rose for the first time in decades, reaching 65 years by 1987. However, the campaign also had significant unintended consequences. The sharp reduction in legal alcohol production led to a booming black market for homemade vodka, or samogon. Soviet citizens began distilling their own alcohol at home, leading to a surge in alcohol poisoning cases as poorly made samogon often contained dangerous levels of methanol and other toxic substances. The financial impact of Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign was also severe. With legal vodka sales plummeting, the Soviet government lost a significant source of revenue. By 1988, the state budget was facing a shortfall of billions of rubles due to the collapse in alcohol tax revenue. This loss of income further exacerbated the economic crisis that was already brewing in the Soviet Union, contributing to the weakening of the Soviet economy in the years leading up to its collapse. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia faced an unprecedented economic crisis. The sudden transition from a centrally planned economy to a market-based system led to rampant inflation, widespread poverty, and the collapse of many state industries. The healthcare system, which had once been publicly funded, began to disintegrate, and access to basic medical care became severely limited. As a result, Russia experienced a sharp decline in living standards, and the health of its population deteriorated. Now let's take a look at the state the Soviet Union left its population in. By 1991, Russia's birth rate was already on the decline, largely due to decades of alcohol abuse, poor healthcare, and economic struggles. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, things got even worse. By 1999, Russia's birth rate had hit a record low, just 8.3 births per 1,000 people, down from around 13 per 1,000 in 1990. In 1991, the average life expectancy for Russian men was about 64 years. However, by 1994, it had plummeted to just 57 years. Women, on the other hand, fared a little better, but their life expectancy also fell from 74 years in 1991 to around 71 by 1994. The post-Soviet years clearly took a heavy toll on the population. Then Boris Yeltsin became the first president of Russia, but his tenure was marked by political instability, economic hardship, and widespread corruption. Yeltsin's government implemented a series of economic reforms known as shock therapy, which involved the rapid privatization of state assets and the liberalization of prices. While these reforms were intended to jumpstart the Russian economy, they instead led to hyperinflation, mass unemployment, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a small group of oligarchs. Deaths from alcohol didn't change and still remained around 30%. Then, in 1999, Vladimir Putin came to power following Yeltsin's resignation, and his presidency marked a period of relative political stability and economic recovery. Under Putin's leadership, the Russian government took significant steps to reduce alcohol consumption. New regulations were introduced to restrict the sale of alcohol, including banning the sale of vodka during certain hours and raising the minimum price of alcohol to make it less affordable. The government also cracked down on the production and sale of illegal vodka, which had become a major problem during the 1990s. In addition, public health campaigns were launched to raise awareness about the dangers of excessive drinking. According to the World Health Organization, these efforts had a noticeable impact. Between 2003 and 2018, alcohol consumption in Russia fell by 43%. By 2015, the average Russian adult was consuming around 10 liters of pure alcohol per year, down from the peak of 18 liters in the mid-1990s. As a result, life expectancy began to rise. By 2019, the average life expectancy for men had increased to 68 years, and for women it had reached 78 years. In addition to addressing alcohol consumption, the Putin government also introduced policies aimed at reversing the country's demographic decline. One of the most notable of these policies was the introduction of the Maternity Capital Program in 2007, which provided financial incentives for families to have more children. This policy, along with economic stabilization, led to a modest increase in the birth rate during the late 2000s and early 2010s. By 2013, the birth rate had risen to 13.3 births per 1,000 people, up from the low of 8.3 per 1,000 in 1999. However, these gains were short-lived. By the mid-2010s, the birth rate began to decline again, and by 2020, it had fallen to 10.1 births per 1,000 people. This demographic decline has been exacerbated by Russia's aging population and a shrinking workforce, both of which are legacies of the demographic crises of the 1990s and early 2000s. Then Putin just made everything worse by invading Ukraine in February 2022. The wars triggered a massive exodus of educated, skilled, and wealthy Russians, leading to what's commonly referred to as a brain drain. Many young professionals, including doctors, engineers, and IT specialists, have fled the country due to fears of conscription, economic sanctions, and the increasing authoritarianism of the Putin regime. It's estimated that between 500,000 and 1 million Russians have left the country since the start of the war, many of whom were highly educated and part of the professional class. This brain drain will have long-term consequences for Russia's economy and its ability to compete on the global stage. The loss of highly skilled workers will make it difficult for Russia to innovate, particularly in industries such as technology, medicine, and engineering. As the country loses its best and brightest, it'll face increasing challenges in maintaining its economic and military strength, especially as Western sanctions continue to bite. The war in Ukraine has also had a direct impact on Russia's demographics. In 2022, it was reported that many of the soldiers sent to fight in Ukraine were from poorer, rural regions of Russia where the demographic situation was already fragile. These regions, particularly in the Caucasus and Siberia, have been hit hard by the war, as young men are either killed in combat or return home with severe injuries, reducing their ability to contribute to the economy or start families. But from Putin's perspective, this war makes sense in terms of demographics. You see, the timing of the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was particularly crucial for Russia. By that year, many of Russia's young men were reaching the age of military service, creating a fleeting window for the government to draw from a relatively stable pool of fighting-age men. This demographic window was critical because Russia's population pyramid, essentially the age structure of the population, has been steadily shifting, with fewer young people coming of age each year due to the long-term demographic decline Russia's been experiencing since the 1990s. Russia's population pyramid, when viewed in detail, shows an increasingly top-heavy structure, which means there are more elderly citizens and fewer young people. In the 1990s, Russia's birth rate plummeted and the country faced a steep population decline. As a result, fewer children were born during that period, creating a gap in the younger age cohorts that's now starting to show its impact. The children born during the early post-Soviet years, those in the 1990s, are now the young adults of today, and their numbers are far smaller compared to previous generations. For a healthy, growing population, the base of the pyramid is wide, representing a large number of children and young adults, and it narrows as it moves upward, indicating fewer elderly people. In Russia's case, however, the pyramid has a constricted base and a bulging middle, reflecting a high proportion of middle-aged and elderly individuals and a shrinking pool of younger people. This generation, now in their mid-20s to early 30s, provided the bulk of Russia's fighting force for the Ukraine invasion. However, had Putin delayed the invasion for several more years, the demographic situation would have worsened to the point where Russia might not have had enough fighting-age men to sustain a large-scale military operation. This demographic shift is often described as a demographic cliff because it represents a sharp decline in the number of young people available to serve in the military. By 2025 or 2030, the majority of the young men who formed the backbone of Russia's fighting force in 2022 would have aged out of the military service range, moving into their 30s and 40s. At the same time, the next generation of recruits, those born after the mid-1990s, would be smaller in number, providing a far less robust pool of conscripts or professional soldiers. But this war will also have a massive impact on Russia's demographics. Thousands of Russian soldiers have already been killed in the conflict, and many more have been wounded. Every young man lost in the war represents a future father, a worker, and a member of the community, further shrinking the already limited pool of potential recruits and economic contributors. As it stands, the war's accelerating Russia's demographic decline, and the loss of life on the battlefield, combined with the brain drain of young professionals, will have long-lasting consequences for the country's military and economic future. Over the next decade, Russia's aging population and shrinking youth cohort will present significant challenges, further weakening its position on the global stage. Russian weapons suck, and that's not me saying it. That's what the situation on the ground shows. At the start of the war, Ukrainian forces carefully examined Russian weapons recovered from the battlefield, hoping to learn any insights that would give them an edge. Maybe they could tweak and improve their own gear to turn the tables and give the Russians a taste of their own medicine. But after a thorough inspection, the Ukrainians quickly realized that most of the Russian weapons were outdated and unreliable. In fact, they were so bad that compared to modern Western weapons, the Ukrainians outright called them, and I quote, ineffective and obsolete. But here's the thing, it isn't always this way. During the Cold War, Soviet weapons were renowned for their reliability and battlefield standards. They were so effective that many countries actually preferred Soviet weapons over Western ones. For instance, in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Russian-made equipment in the hands of Egypt and Syria almost managed to overpower the Western equipment used by Israel. Back then, Russian gear was known for its high lethality and had a certain level of innovation. So where did everything go wrong? That's exactly what we're going to explore today. First, be sure to hit the like button below. In this video, I'm going to expose the incompetence of the Russian army and Putin's regime. So I'm sure Russian bots will try to downvote the video to kill its reach. So your likes help us out tremendously in the algorithm. I know some Russian bots watching this might argue and try to defend their military. And hey, I get it, Russia's army's huge. It supposedly got the second strongest air force, a massive inventory of tank and artillery, and even the second largest navy. But despite all that, they haven't been able to invade a nation that's almost 10 times weaker in terms of military strength. According to official reports from Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, Russian armored vehicles and helicopters are allegedly so poorly made that they can't even withstand small arms fire. And when it comes to their so-called precision-guided missiles, they're failing at rates as high as 66%. At this point, calling them precision-guided seems more like wishful thinking than reality. To make matters worse, reports like this started popping up back in 2022, and since then, Russian weaponry has only taken a bigger hit to its reputation. So what changed from the late 1900s to now? A few decades ago, the USSR wasn't just a superpower in terms of ideology and military might, it was also one of the world's leading arms suppliers. The USSR invested heavily in research and development, producing weapons that were not only reliable but also ahead of their time in many ways. In fact, according to the Central Intelligence Agency, the USSR allocated a staggering 15 to 17% of its gross national product to defense spending. This was monumental, especially when you consider that the United States dedicated about 5 to 7% of its GNP to defense during the same period. Such substantial investment was funneled into various facets of military development, including a massive nuclear arsenal, conventional forces, and cutting-edge research in military technology. The focus wasn't just on national defense. It was a strategic move to project power and influence on a global scale, during an era defined by ideological conflicts in the Cold War. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union possessed 40,000 nuclear warheads, surpassing the United States in sheer numbers. This investment in nuclear technology was matched by advancements in missile systems, radar technology, and aerospace engineering, all requiring substantial financial resources and a highly skilled workforce. But what truly set Soviet weapons apart was their renowned reliability and the global trust they commanded. Simplicity was at the heart of Soviet weapon design. By favoring straightforward designs over complex ones, the USSR ensured its weapons were easy to produce, operate, and maintain. This simplicity reduced the likelihood of mechanical failures and made it feasible to train large numbers of soldiers quickly and efficiently. Not only that, but these weapons were engineered to perform under the most challenging conditions, whether in the freezing temperatures of Siberia or the scorching deserts of Central Asia. From the 1950s until its dissolution in 1991, the USSR supplied weapons to over 60 countries. By exporting arms to allied nations and liberation movements, the Soviet Union extended its influence and ideology across the globe. This widespread distribution meant that Soviet weapons were used in various conflicts across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. According to data from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the Soviet Union accounted for approximately 40% of global arms exports during the 1980s. So given this impressive legacy, how did Soviet weapons stack up against those of the West, particularly the United States? While American arms were often at the forefront of technology, boasting advanced avionics, precision-guided munitions, and sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities, the Soviet Union took a different route. They focused on crafting weapons that were robust, reliable, and cost-effective. Take the AK-47 assault rifle, for instance. It didn't just become popular. It became the weapon of choice for countless guerrilla movements worldwide. Why? Because of its durability and ease of use, even under the harshest conditions. This rifle's presence spans continents, used by the armed forces of over 80 countries and innumerable non-state actors. Its low production cost and straightforward manufacturing, often achievable with basic machinery, made it an ideal export for the Soviet Union to extend its influence during the Cold War. On the flip side, US counterparts like the M16, while more advanced, required meticulous maintenance and were less forgiving in adverse environments. This highlighted a fundamental difference in design philosophy between the two superpowers. Now, when we dive into the numbers, the success of the original AK-47 and its variants is staggering. It's estimated that over 100 million units have been produced globally, making it the most widely distributed firearm in history. That's not just a statistic. It's a testament to its enduring legacy. However, the post-Soviet era brought challenges that began to erode this legacy. Russia's emphasis on mass production without significant modernization led to a surplus of outdated models. These couldn't compete with newer, more advanced firearms entering the global market. While other nations invested heavily in research and development to enhance accuracy, ergonomics, and adaptability, Russia started lagging behind. This issue isn't limited to the AK series. It extends to almost all the weapons we're seeing now in the Ukraine war. We'll get to them one by one, but for now, let's focus back on the AK series. Recently, we crossed 1 million subscribers. Ever since then, we've been flooded with emails asking us questions and advice about growing a channel on YouTube. Even though we try our best to reply to every single email, sometimes these take up too much time or they ask the same question we've answered before. That's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one email bootcamp for completely free. So if you're someone interested in starting your own YouTube channel, you can get your email bootcamp by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code on the screen. Now, back to the video. The absence of healthy competition within Russia's arms industry contributed to stagnation. This allowed international competitors to overtake them. Firearms like the American M4 and the German HK-416 began setting new standards in modularity and performance, offering features modern militaries found indispensable. Recognizing the need to modernize, Russia attempted to introduce the AK-12 as part of its Ratnik Modern Infantry program. The goal was to bring back the iconic AK series into the 21st century. The AK-12 was designed to address the limitations of its predecessors by incorporating features like improved ergonomics, modularity, and compatibility with advanced optics and accessories. When the AK-12 was first prototyped in 2011, soldiers and defense analysts around the world were buzzing with excitement. On paper, it looked like a significant leap forward, but the reality didn't quite live up to the hype. The AK-12 faced criticism for failing to deliver substantial improvements over earlier models. While it introduced some modern features, the core mechanics remained largely unchanged from the original AK design. This meant issues like inherent accuracy limitations and ergonomic shortcomings persisted. The situation became more concerning when Russian soldiers on the front lines in Ukraine began heavily criticizing the AK-12. Photos surfaced showing cracked parts and reports of problems like components not fitting properly, malfunctions, and durability issues emerged almost immediately. The rifle was so problematic that soldiers started reverting to their old AKMS rifles from storage. As a result, it's no surprise that no other countries have shown interest in adopting the AK-12. Instead, nations are opting for firearms like the American M4 and M16, the German AK-416, the Belgian FN Scar, and the Israeli IWI Tavor. Guns that offer the modern features and reliability the AK-12 failed to deliver. This decline isn't just about a single rifle. It carries significant economic implications that ripple throughout Russia's entire defense industry and economy. Back in the 1980s, AK rifle exports weren't just a part of the Soviet Union's arms trade. They were a cornerstone, constituting about 10 to 15% of the total arms exports. During that golden era, Soviet weapons exports were substantial, with estimates suggesting they reached around $40 billion per year. However, as time went on, this robust export market began to falter. By the early 2000s, small arms exports had dropped by almost 50%. The export value of the AK series saw an even steeper decline over the years, with estimates indicating that revenue from AK rifle exports decreased by over 70% compared to Soviet levels. Moving into the 2010s, Russia's total arms exports continued to face challenges. Russia's total arms exports dropped below the $20 billion mark between 2000 and 2004. This figure represents literally half of what the Soviet Union achieved during its peak years. All the while, other countries had grown in that time. And now, in the 2020s, the challenges for Russia have only intensified. Even its most trusted allies like India have significantly reduced their purchases of Russian military hardware. Instead, they're turning to countries like France and Israel for advanced technology and reliable weaponry. In 2023, for the first time, Russia slipped to become the world's third largest arms exporter, falling just behind France. Russia's arms exports fell by a staggering 53% between the periods of 2014 to 2018 and 2019 to 2023. The number of countries purchasing major Russian arms dropped from 31% in 2019 to just 12% in 2023. But here's the thing, this decline isn't solely due to the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The downward trend in Russian arms exports started even before the full-scale invasion. So while Russia's exports dwindled, France was making significant strides, increasing its share of global arms exports from 24% to an impressive 42%. But how did they do it? Well, France secured major deals for Dassault Aviation's Rafale fighter jets with countries like Qatar, Egypt, Indonesia, and India. Russia losing Indian deals was a massive blow because India is the world's largest arms importer. Although Russia is still India's main supplier, accounting for 36% of India's arms imports from 2019 to 2023, this is still a significant drop from the dominant position Russia once held in India's defense market. Given the current trajectory, it's highly unlikely that Russia will be able to recover in the next 5 years, or maybe even a decade. Sure, Putin has recently ramped up Russia's defense industry, churning out countless artillery rounds, missiles, and drones. But let's be honest, the damage has already been done. Years of neglect and corruption can't be undone overnight. This surge in production might boost the numbers on paper, but it can't mask the underlying weaknesses. On top of that, this so-called new production isn't necessarily new, because Russia simply didn't have enough time or skills to manufacture weapons at the rate its military wants, and frankly needs. So they've been dumpster diving into Soviet-era stockpiles and cannibalizing old equipment just to keep up appearances. It's like trying to fix a modern car with parts from a vintage model. It might get you moving for a bit, but it's definitely not a long-term solution. A very good example of Russia's declining military strength is its tank fleet. Since the late 20th century, both the Soviet Union and now Russia have taken immense pride in their tanks. Models like the T-72, T-80, and more recently the T-90 were once considered formidable forces on the battlefield. These tanks were symbols of Soviet engineering prowess, robust, powerful, and designed to go head-to-head with their Western counterparts. The T-90, for instance, was hailed as a significant upgrade with better armor, firepower, and mobility compared to its predecessors. But the Ukraine wars exposed a ton of vulnerabilities. We'll get into those in a minute, but did you know that Russia claims to have the largest tank fleet in the world? On paper, they boast anywhere from 10,000 to 20,000 tanks. This number is greater than the combined total of the US and China. However, Russia's tank count also includes tanks that have been in reserve since the Soviet era, held for potential future conflicts. It's important to recognize that not all of these tanks are ready for combat. Many are outdated, poorly maintained, or missing essential parts needed to operate effectively. Additionally, not all stored tanks can be repaired because they've been exposed to the elements for decades, making some beyond repair. Just so you know, tanks are pretty easy to count since most of them are stored outside. Using satellite images, analysts can monitor these stockpiles and see how they're being used up over time. For instance, in 2022, satellite photos showed a significant drop in the number of tanks at major Russian bases, hinting at heavy losses in the field. There are still plenty of things we don't fully know, like the actual number of active tanks Russia has. Online sources often give conflicting numbers, but according to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, or IISS, in their Military Balance 2022 report, Russia had about 2,947 main battle tanks in active service. This includes modern models like the T-72B3, T-80U, and T-90A. However, open-source investigators have estimated that since the start of the war in Ukraine, Russia has lost more than 2,600 tanks. These losses include 1,725 tanks destroyed, 145 damaged, 205 abandoned, and 544 captured, with models ranging from T-55s to T-90s. But that's just based on the photos and videos available to the public. The real number could be higher, potentially leaving Russia with only a few hundred tanks from its pre-war stock. Now, you might be wondering why Russia's losing so many tanks, especially to Ukraine. Simply put, Ukraine's been executing some brilliant tactics on the battlefield. But that's only part of the story. There are other factors at play, too. First off, the equipment Russia's using hasn't always lived up to its reputation. And their tanks are facing a modern battlefield, where drones, anti-tank guided missiles, and evolving military tactics have changed the game entirely. It's not as simple as sheer numbers anymore. It's all about how you use them, and Ukraine's been proving that point every day. Take the Javelin missile system, for example. Ukraine's been using these like crazy because they're highly effective against armored vehicles. The Javelin missile uses an infrared imaging system to precisely lock onto its target. Once launched, it flies autonomously, making it harder for enemy forces to intercept. This is a game changer compared to older systems like the Kornet or the Metis-M, which require the operator to guide the missile all the way to the target, increasing the risk of detection and counterattack. Not only that, but the Javelin's top attack flight profile is specifically designed to target the less armored sections of tanks, like the engine and command modules. This makes them lethal against even the most advanced Russian tanks, such as the T-90 and the newer T-14 Armata. Since the conflict with Russia intensified in 2022, Ukraine has been equipped with thousands of Javelin missiles. According to the United States Department of Defense, over 1,600 Javelin missiles were delivered to Ukraine by early 2023. By January 2024, the US had provided more than 10,000 Javelin systems and 50 Javelin command launch units. With that kind of firepower, it's safe to say that Russian tanks are facing an uphill battle. Those Javelins make it nearly impossible for them to stand a chance. But the impact of the Javelin goes beyond just the numbers. According to open-source intelligence from organizations like Bellingcat and reports from Ukrainian defense officials, Javelins have been responsible for taking out hundreds of Russian tanks and armored vehicles since their deployment. For example, by mid-2023, estimates suggest that Ukrainian forces had destroyed 1,000 Russian tanks using Javelins alone. This figure doesn't account for additional losses caused by other anti-tank weapons or combined arms tactics, meaning the actual impact is likely even greater. To put this into perspective, each Javelin missile costs about $80,000, whereas tanks can cost upwards of $6 million each. Not to mention the ongoing expenses of maintenance, fuel, and crew training. When you're losing tanks at a high rate and the cost to replace them is so steep, it's a financial drain that's hard to justify, especially under the weight of international sanctions. Coming back to the second point, Russia's logistical issues have made it almost impossible to keep their tanks operational. With international sanctions cutting off access to crucial parts and technology, maintaining and repairing their tank fleet has become a nightmare. The lack of spare parts means that even if a tank is damaged but not destroyed, it might be out of commission for extended periods, reducing the overall effectiveness of the fleet. You've probably seen pictures of Russian tanks being towed away by Ukrainian farmers' tractors. Some of those tanks were abandoned because they ran out of fuel. That's a major logistical failure right there. Others got stuck in springtime mud because the high command decided to invade at the wrong time of year. Timing and terrain are crucial in warfare, and poor planning can turn a strategic advantage into a logistical nightmare overnight. Many tanks have been abandoned due to bad driving. Some have been pushed off bridges, while others have been driven into ditches, causing the tracks to come off. And often, soldiers have simply abandoned their vehicles and fled the battlefield. In a war, tanks are supposed to clear the way for infantry and protect them from enemy machine gun fire. But now, with Ukraine armed with cheap explosive drones and the Javelin missile system, it seems like Russian soldiers are sent out first to clear the path and then the tanks follow. But that strategy isn't working. Instead, Russia's losing over 1,000 soldiers every single day. If that doesn't highlight the lack of coordination and poor planning in the Russian military, I don't know what does. So clearly something had to change. Putin, being Putin, threw millions at the problem and told his top scientists to figure something out. They needed to come up with something to counter these drone strikes and those deadly Javelin missiles. Months of research later, they proudly presented their big solution. If you squint, you might just see a tank under there. Yeah, their big innovation was to slap what looks like a shed and a cage on top of the tank's turret. Now, I was joking about the whole top scientist part, but it's still funny when you think about it. This so-called military superpower came up with metal sheets and grills? That's the best they've got? But hey, when you actually think about it, it kinda makes sense. You see, the Javelin missile can tear through armor that's up to 760 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor. That's enough to cut through nearly any tank on the planet like a hot knife through butter. But what makes the Javelin so lethal is its two-stage warhead. The first charge, a smaller one, is designed to take out explosive reactive armor, the outer layer meant to absorb the initial impact. Then comes the big boy charge, which delivers the final, devastating blow. This system is timed so precisely that the second charge detonates just moments after the first, ensuring maximum damage. Now, here's the problem for the Russians. No modern tank, including Russia's workhorse T-72, T-90, or its most recent T-14, has anywhere near the armor thickness required to withstand a Javelin strike, especially on the top, which is its weakest point. Tanks would need armor well over 76 centimeters thick to even have a chance, but even imagining that scenario becomes laughable. If we assume Russia might be stupid enough to do it, then it would end badly. Let me show you the math behind it. The top of a T-72 tank is around 40 square meters. To cover that with 76 centimeter thick armor, you'd need about 28 cubic meters of steel. Now, with steel weighing 8 tons per cubic meter, that means you're adding 224 tons of armor on top of a tank that already weighs 40 tons. So even Putin isn't dumb enough to try that. Or maybe he is, who knows. But that's where the whole cage idea comes in. A thin metal structure placed above the tank to try and detonate the Javelin's first charge prematurely. The theory goes that if the cage absorbs the first hit, the tank's reactive armor will be left intact to handle the second, more powerful charge. It's not just about Javelins either. These cages are also designed to ward off the threat from smaller FPV drones, which have become a favorite tool for Ukrainian forces. Make no mistake, the cope cage isn't supposed to stop everything. It's more about giving the tank a fighting chance. And surprisingly, to some extent, it has worked. These tanks have become more resistant to drone attacks, and over the last year, they've actually been improving the design. At first, people laughed at them, calling it emotional support armor. But now these turtle-like tanks are proving to be pretty effective. The Ukrainians even started making their own versions of them. But like any innovation in war, Ukraine has found ways to adapt. Drones are no longer solely targeting the tops of Russian tanks. Instead, they're going after other weak points, like the tracks and road wheels. Once these critical parts are disabled, the tank becomes immobilized, a sitting duck waiting for the finishing blow from missiles or additional drones. According to reports from NATO officials, small FPV drones have accounted for around 2/3 of Russian tank losses in recent months, proving that these tanks are far from invincible. And let's not forget that the Javelin is still a beast of a weapon. The cope cage might work to an extent, but no amount of metal bars will stop a well-placed Javelin strike. On top of all that, these cope cages come with some pretty big downsides. For starters, they make the tank slow and heavy. Sure, they might not be 760 millimeters thick, but the extra metal still adds weight, and that weight messes with how the tank moves. Plus, with all that stuff on top, the tanks can't even rotate their turrets properly, which means they can't aim or fire as easily. The visibility from inside the tank gets worse too, making it harder for the crew to see what's going on around them. There have even been multiple cases where these turtle tanks get completely off track during an assault. With all that extra armor, it's like they're wandering around half blind, and for all the supposed protection the cope cage gives, they're not exactly making these tanks invincible. From reports on the ground, only about 1 in 4 of these turtle tanks actually make it back to the base after an assault. Yeah, that's about a 25% survival rate. And who knows if that surviving tank even accomplished anything in the battle? The numbers sure aren't looking great for Russia. If Russia keeps sticking to the same plan and doesn't change its war strategy, then in the next 2 years, it's not just going to run out of capable tanks, but a lot of other weapons too. Russia's biggest issue with using tanks is the lack of a solid combined arms strategy. Now, a combined arms approach means integrating different military capabilities, like infantry, armor, artillery, and air support, to cover each other's weaknesses and maximize effectiveness. It's something the Russian military has consistently struggled with. Meanwhile, Ukraine has been excelling at their combined arms approach. They've been coordinating their forces in a way that's giving them a real edge on the battlefield. The Kursk offensive is probably the best example I can give you right now. But have you ever wondered why Russia or even the Soviet Union was so obsessed with its tank fleets? You see, even today, Russia's military tactics are heavily influenced by the Soviet-era deep battle doctrine. In simple terms, the Soviets focused on using large numbers of tanks and artillery to break through enemy defenses and advance deep into their territory. The main idea was to attack not just the enemy's front lines, but also from the areas behind them, like supply lines and reserves, to disrupt their ability to fight back. They would gather massive formations of tanks to create a powerful force capable of punching through defenses. These tanks could move quickly and had strong firepower, allowing them to overcome obstacles and engage enemy forces effectively. And that's exactly what Russia tried to do right before the full-scale invasion. Russia launched simultaneous attacks from north toward Kiev, from the east, and from the south, attempting to quickly incapacitate Ukrainian command and control structures. They also used long-range artillery to wreak havoc and disrupt supply lines deep within Ukrainian territory. At first, Russia was making impressive progress, almost capturing Kiev. But then Western weapons started rolling in. Advanced anti-tank missiles, drones, and other modern equipment began to level the playing field. Fast forward 2 years, and now it's reached a point where Kiev has occupied more Russian territory than Russia's taken over in Ukraine this year. This just goes to show how effective Ukraine's strategies have been, and how terrible the Russian weapons and strategy are. I guess Putin's still in denial that times have changed. Modern warfare isn't just about who has more tanks or bigger guns. It's about technology, coordination, and adaptability. Ukraine's embraced this by integrating modern technology and tactics into their military operations. Russia, on the other hand, seems stuck in the past. Their reliance on large tank formations without proper support leaves them vulnerable to modern anti-tank weapons and guerrilla tactics. Speaking of the deep battle doctrine, artillery has always been a crucial part of Russian military strategy, both historically and in the current conflict. This reliance on artillery has been both a strength and a weakness for Russia. I call it a strength because for centuries artillery has been known as the king of battle, and that still holds true today. In the Russia-Ukraine war, artillery fire accounts for about 80% of casualties on both sides. The sheer destructive power of artillery can't be underestimated. It's capable of leveling entire structures, disrupting supply lines, and creating psychological terror among troops. The Russians have a vast arsenal of artillery pieces, from traditional howitzers to multiple rocket launch systems, or MRLSs, giving them the ability to launch massive barrages. But here's where it becomes a weakness. Russian artillery, in many ways, is fundamentally flawed. Due to rampant corruption, many of the weapons are poorly maintained and manufactured, making accurate targeting nearly impossible. The soldiers tasked with operating and maintaining these artillery pieces are often undertrained, undisciplined, and sometimes just not up to the task. This lack of professionalism leads to misfires, accidents, and ineffective bombardments that waste precious ammunition. Moreover, Russia heavily relies on cheap, unguided Grad systems that fire basic, unguided rockets. These are among the most widely used artillery systems by Russia, and they're not accurate at all. These rockets are mostly fired in bulk to saturate large areas rather than hitting specific targets. Sure, you might hit something with enough rockets, but the downside is that it takes an insane amount of ammo to achieve that kind of result. This puts a massive strain on their logistics and wears down their artillery systems themselves much faster. That's why no Western country uses Grad MLRSs. Instead, they opt for smart guided rockets in their systems, like HIMARS. These precision weapons allow for accurate strikes on high-value targets with far less ammunition. To be fair, both Ukraine and Russia have been struggling to keep their artillery units supplied with enough ammunition to stay operational. But the difference is, Ukraine gets resupplied through international aid. On the other hand, Putin's out there begging for help from his allies like North Korea, Iran, and China. You probably heard that Putin recently visited North Korea for the first time in 24 years. And what was he doing there? asking Kim Jong-un for ballistic missiles, artillery shells, and other munitions. In return, Russia's reportedly giving North Korea food and helping them with the tech they need to launch satellites. It's a pretty desperate situation when you have to turn to North Korea for support. But analysts believe that North Korea's weapons stockpiles are aging and ineffective, and are unlikely to provide Putin with the solution he needs in Ukraine. Beyond ammunition shortages, Russia now faces a new and far more serious problem. Artillery barrels don't last forever. A howitzer barrel, for example, is usually good for a few thousand shots before it starts to wear down. When that happens, the steel becomes brittle or bends, and if they keep using it without replacing it, they risk some serious accidents. We're talking about shells exploding inside the guns, which is something we've already seen multiple times with Russian artillery. On top of that, making artillery barrels isn't easy. You need high-quality steel and precision engineering to get it right. Before the war, Russia had only 2 factories capable of producing artillery barrels, the Motovilica plant in Perm and the Barakati in Volgorod. Even with these factories running, it's clear they're struggling to keep up with the demand for replacement barrels. With the rate at which they're firing their artillery, they actively need thousands of new barrels just to maintain their current operations. To mitigate this, Russia's been pulling older artillery pieces out of long-term storage, specifically Cold War-era towed howitzers. While this strategy provides a temporary solution to supplying spare barrels and parts, it's not sustainable in the long term. Back in 2021, the Kremlin was sitting on about 19,000 old towed artillery pieces. However, many of these stored weapons have been exposed to the elements for decades, rendering some unusable. After 2 years of intense fighting, they're down to around 7,500 stored towed pieces. The recovered barrels, plus any new ones Russian industry has managed to produce, were enough to keep 2,000 howitzers firing for 2 years. Assuming most of the remaining 7,500 old towed howitzers in storage aren't completely worn out, these guns, stripped for parts, could keep the frontline batteries operational for another 2 years. But after that, what then? Not only is Russia struggling to replace their worn-out artillery barrels, but Ukraine's also destroying loads of their artillery every month. In the beginning, when Russia first invaded, they relied hard on their artillery. The plan was simple: use massive artillery shellings to destroy Ukrainian defenses and push them back. Just hit them so hard with artillery that their tanks and armored vehicles would have an easy ride forward. But here's where things went off the rails. Russia's strategy, though powerful on paper, had some major flaws. They wanted to recreate their past success with mass artillery strikes, but the reality of modern warfare hit them hard. Ukraine wasn't just sitting there taking the hits. With modern tech like precision-guided munitions and advanced counter-artillery systems, the Ukrainians made life hell for Russian artillery units. Every time the Russians tried to fire, Ukraine's counter-battery fire, powered by Western-supplied artillery and surveillance drones, was right there to take out key Russian assets. Meanwhile, Ukraine has also developed and deployed its own radars for counter-battery roles, including Zoopark 3, which offers a range of several dozens of kilometers and a 180-degree coverage. In addition, the United States has supplied several counter-battery radars, including the AN/TPQ-36 Firefinder and AN/TPQ-49 lightweight countermortar radars. All 3 radars are used to identify artillery munitions in the air and trace the path of projectiles back to the likely positions of the guns or launchers. Moreover, Russia's emphasis on artillery without proper combined arms integration meant that their forces often lacked the coordination necessary to capitalize on the advantages provided by artillery strikes. In modern warfare, artillery should work in tandem with infantry, armored units, and air support to achieve a synergistic effect. However, Russian forces have repeatedly deployed artillery in isolation, lacking adequate infantry support to advance and secure the areas affected by shelling. But even after 2 years into the war, the Russians still haven't learned their lessons. The recent Ukrainian operation across the Russian border into Kursk is a perfect example. While Ukraine was invading into Russia, the Kursk region had nearly 200 artillery pieces stationed there. Now, think about that. 200 artillery pieces should have been a game changer for Russia. If they'd been deployed properly, they could have wreaked havoc on the advancing Ukrainian troops. But guess what happened? The gunners weren't even ready to fire. Despite all that firepower sitting right there, Russia failed to deploy it effectively. So why did this happen? Well, it seems they got too comfortable. They assumed Ukraine wouldn't dare challenge them so close to home. That kind of overconfidence, mixed with poor intelligence, really cost them. Instead of mounting a strong defense, they let another opportunity slip through their fingers. Now, you'd think that even if the artillery wasn't ready, Russia would have had other means to respond quickly. And you're right, they did. They had Kalino Air Base, the closest military base to Sutsha, the border town where Ukraine made its surprise move. Kalino hosts the Russian Air Force's 14th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment. This regiment boasts 24 Sukhoi Su-30SM fighter bombers. These jets have been primarily used to carry Ka-B glide bombs and have been a significant part of Russia's offensive operations, firing hundreds of these bombs at Ukrainian targets from dozens of miles behind the front lines. Ka-B stands for Korektiruemaya Aviationная Bomba, which translates to Correctable Aerial Bomb. Basically, these are Soviet-era bombs upgraded with extendable wings and a guidance system, making them more accurate and giving them a longer range. Since they don't use propulsion or emit a heat signature, they're also small and hard to detect on radar. To be fair, if deployed correctly, these Ka-Bs can be pretty devastating. But, like most Russian weapons, there's a catch. You see, Ka-Bs are most efficient when launched from fighter jets flying at high altitudes. This allows them to glide over long distances and hit their targets with precision. But here's the problem. Flying at high altitudes makes these jets vulnerable to advanced air defense systems, specifically the Western ones like the Patriot missiles that Ukraine now possesses. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians were proactive and well prepared. They started by jamming radio communications, which threw a wrench into the Russian military's ability to coordinate. On top of that, the Ukrainians flooded the airspace over Kursk with explosive drones. And they didn't stop there. Ukrainian forces continued firing with their own artillery, including their highly effective American-made high-mobility artillery rocket systems, or HIMARS for short. With HIMARS, they could hit Russian positions while staying out of range of most Russian artillery. So when Ukraine made its move, Russia tried to respond. They scrambled some of their Su-30SM jets to push back the Ukrainian forces, and also deployed BM-21 rocket launchers that were stationed at the garrison. But here's the thing. The Ukrainian forces were ready for this. Not only did they have the upper hand with their explosive drones, but their anti-aircraft batteries were also on high alert. They managed to shoot down several Russian helicopters. On the flip side, Russian artillery only managed to damage one Ukrainian Buk air defense vehicle. That's it. For all their efforts, they had little to show. So, with nothing to fear, Ukrainian forces continued to press forward, marching into neighboring Kursk and capturing several towns, including most of Sutsha. The Russian army attempted to mobilize reinforcements, but Ukrainian rockets and artillery fire blocked most of them from reaching the front lines in Kursk. It really shows what can be done with good coordination and the right weapons. The Ukrainians were always one step ahead, predicting Russia's moves and responding quickly and effectively. Now, this brings us to an important question. What about Russia's missiles? Before the war, Russia took immense pride in them. They flaunted their missile technology in parades and promotional videos, showcasing their precision and destructive capabilities. So where were these missiles when they needed them most? First off, a lot of Russia's missile arsenal comes straight from the Soviet era. Back then, during the height of the Cold War, the Soviets built an impressive stockpile of weaponry. But that was decades ago, and while they produced massive quantities, these missiles were designed to be used quickly, not stored for half a century. Today, Russia's left trying to make do with what's left from that time. For example, take the Kh-55 and Kh-22 cruise missiles. Both were originally developed in the 1970s and 80s. The Soviet Union was pumping these out in preparation for a conflict that luckily never happened. Fast forward to today, and many of these missiles have simply aged out. Reports suggest that Russia had anywhere from 7,000 to 8,000 long-range missiles in its stockpile at the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That might sound like a lot, but as the war drags on, it becomes obvious that those stockpile numbers are dwindling fast. Ukrainian military intelligence claims that Russia has already used more than 60% of its pre-war stockpile of precision missiles. These aren't numbers you can just replace overnight. Building new missiles requires high-tech components, many of which are now difficult to acquire due to international sanctions. And then there's the accuracy issue. Russian missiles have repeatedly demonstrated terrible accuracy, with many failing to even reach their intended targets. A stark example of this is the Caliber missile, Russia's supposedly advanced cruise missile that's been one of the main tools for hitting Ukrainian infrastructure. According to Ukrainian sources, and even backed up by Western intelligence, a significant portion of these missiles either miss their target completely or get intercepted. On the other hand, Ukraine, using a mix of Western-supplied equipment like the Iris-T and old Soviet-designed S-300s, has managed to shoot down a surprising number of Calibers and other Russian cruise missiles. Ukraine's reported intercepting over 700 Russian missiles since the start of the war, which says a lot about how well these modern weapons are holding up against a determined defense. If Russia wants to keep up with the aid Ukraine's receiving from Western nations, it needs to maintain its missile production at an incredible rate. But it turns out that Russia's struggling mainly because modern missiles require sophisticated electronics, which are most often sourced from Western countries. With sanctions in place, Russia's access to crucial components like microchips has been severely cut off. So, Russian engineers are left cannibalizing household appliances like washing machines to salvage microchips that can be reused in their weapons. This might sound almost unbelievable, but that's how desperate they've become. We've also seen Russia resort to using older missiles that weren't even designed for the purposes they're being used for now. For example, Kh-22 missiles, originally meant for targeting aircraft carriers, have been used in attacks on Ukrainian cities. These missiles are massive, carry a large payload, and were designed for high-speed strikes against naval targets. Using them against ground targets in densely populated areas makes them extremely inaccurate, turning them into blunt instruments that cause a lot of collateral damage rather than hitting specific military objectives. This lack of precision has cost civilian lives and led to significant international criticism. And it's not just the older missiles. Even Russia's most advanced next-gen missiles are struggling. For instance, the Iskander missile, a short-range ballistic missile system. At least on paper, these missiles are capable of maneuvering during flight, which theoretically should make them harder to intercept. But in reality, they've been plagued with technical problems and reliability issues. Reports from Ukrainian front lines indicate that a good amount of Iskander missiles have failed mid-flight or just outright hit someplace else that's not even close to their intended target. In fact, a Pentagon report estimated that a failure rate for Russian missiles overall is as high as 60%. That's an astonishing number when you consider the resources and time that go into making each missile. We can only speculate on what the real issue might be, but most fingers point to the GPS system. You see, the US, for example, relies heavily on GPS-guided munitions that have a far higher success rate when it comes to precision. Meanwhile, Russia relies on the GLONASS system, but it's nowhere near the same level of accuracy. Another reason might be using a missile for a purpose it wasn't built for. For example, the S-300 air defense missiles are old Soviet-era systems. They were never intended to be used offensively against ground targets. The fact that Russia's resorted to using them this way suggests that they're running dangerously low on more suitable types of missiles. But just think about it. Russians know that the S-300s are highly inaccurate, yet they're launching them into Ukraine knowing full well that they'll probably hit a civilian area rather than their original target. Fortunately, Russia will soon run out of missiles, but this might not be a good thing for Ukraine, because then the Russians might be forced to resort to much more dangerous and lethal weapons. Even if Russia manages to maintain its production rate, the sheer cost involved will put a massive dent in the economy. Caliber cruise missiles, for example, cost somewhere between $1.5 and $6.5 million each, depending on the variant. Given the hundreds, if not thousands of missiles fired at Ukrainian targets so far, the financial burden on the Russian state is immense. Every time a missile fails to hit its mark or gets intercepted by Ukrainian defenses, it's not just a military failure. It's a massive waste of resources that Russia can't afford at this point. The same goes for its air force, but there the cost is multiple times higher. Now let's get into why Russian aircraft have been struggling so much in the war with Ukraine. In just a few months, it'll be 3 years since Russia launched this full-scale invasion. And honestly, their air force was expected to be a major factor in the conflict. Many believed they'd dominate the skies, gain complete air superiority, and make the war a lot shorter than it's turned out to be. But things didn't quite work out that way. Instead, Russia's aircraft have faced major problems, from poor planning to outdated technology. To this day, not once has Russia achieved air superiority in Ukraine. Air superiority means having control over the skies. For any military campaign to be successful, controlling the skies is crucial. It allows for easy bombing runs, air cover for ground troops, and the ability to strike enemy positions without much risk. But in Ukraine, Russian aircraft are constantly on their back foot. Given Russia's advantage in terms of the number of aircraft and overall military resources, this should have been one of the first things they accomplished. But they didn't, and there are many reasons for that, with one of the most critical being that they underestimated Ukrainian air defenses. The Russian Air Force went into Ukraine with an overconfident strategy, assuming they could suppress or destroy Ukrainian air defenses quickly. However, Ukraine was prepared, and they had more advanced help from Western nations than anyone initially thought. Ukraine used a mix of old Soviet-era air defense systems like the S-300 alongside newer systems provided by NATO and Western allies. The S-300, for example, is an older missile system, but still packs a punch when it comes to shooting down aircraft. Ukraine's military was already experienced with this system, and they were able to utilize it to full effect. On top of that, Western nations began providing Ukraine with man-portable air defense systems, or MANPADS, like the Stinger missile. These lightweight shoulder-fired missiles are incredibly effective against low-flying aircraft and helicopters, and Ukrainian forces have used them to great success. In addition to these defenses, Ukraine received more modern and advanced systems such as the NASAMS, which significantly increased their capability to target Russian planes at higher altitudes. This forced Russian pilots to fly at altitudes that put them within range of multiple defense systems, either risking interception by more advanced SAMs like the NASAMS or exposing themselves to MANPADS by flying lower. Essentially, they had no good choices, and this has led to considerable aircraft losses. As of early 2024, estimates suggest that Russia's lost a total of 359 planes and 326 helicopters. These losses include some of their supposedly advanced jets like the Su-34, Su-30, and Su-35. But why is Russia losing so many aircraft? You see, Russia's jets like the Su-25 Frogfoot are designed for close air support. Their very nature involves flying low to engage ground targets. This puts them directly in the range of Ukrainian air defenses. Sure, the Su-25 is heavily armored, but it's still vulnerable to shoulder-fired missiles like the Stinger, and this vulnerability has been reflected in the losses. Unfortunately for Russia, much of its air fleet consists of upgraded versions of Soviet-era aircraft. These planes were designed for a different era, and despite various upgrades, many simply can't compete in modern warfare. Planes like the Su-24 Fencer and Su-25 Frogfoot are ground attack aircraft that were originally built in the 1960s and 1970s. Even the more modern Su-30 and Su-35 fighters, while highly capable on paper, are based on older designs that struggle to keep up with modern Western aircraft in terms of avionics, electronic warfare capabilities, and precision weaponry. These limitations become particularly glaring when you look at the advanced systems Ukraine has received from its Western allies. Russia's aircraft don't have the same level of precision-guided munitions or the kind of advanced avionics and targeting systems that Western fighter jets like the F-35 or F-16 have. For example, the Su-34, Russia's most modern strike aircraft, has been plagued by poor performance. Designed to replace older bombers, the Su-34 is supposed to be highly versatile and capable of both air-to-air and air-to-ground missions. Yet in Ukraine, it's been largely ineffective, with several being shot down. Another major issue for Russia has been the level of pilot training, because at the end of the day, aircraft are only as good as the pilots flying them. Reports indicate that Russian pilots receive fewer flight hours per year than US or NATO pilots, and that lack of training shows on the battlefield. In a conflict like this, where pilots are up against advanced air defenses and are required to conduct complex air operations, those flight hours make a huge difference. Additionally, the tactics used by Russia have been relatively outdated. At the start of the conflict, many analysts expected Russia to use a coordinated approach, combining electronic warfare to jam Ukrainian radar, conducting SEAD or suppression of enemy air defenses missions to neutralize Ukrainian air defenses, and then using their aircraft freely. Instead, they failed to do so effectively, and Ukraine's air defenses remained largely intact. Part of the reason for this was poor coordination between the different branches of Russia's military. The Air Force, Army, and electronic warfare units didn't seem to operate in a fully integrated manner, which is crucial for modern air campaigns. As a result, Russian aircraft were left vulnerable to well-prepared Ukrainian defenses. Another factor that significantly affected Russian air operations is the intelligence support Ukraine's received from Western countries, particularly the United States. They've provided Ukraine with real-time intelligence about Russian troop movements and aircraft operations. This has given Ukrainian forces a huge advantage, allowing them to anticipate Russian strikes and position their. But after a thorough inspection, the Ukrainians quickly realized that most of the Russian weapons were outdated and unreliable. In fact, they were so bad that compared to modern Western weapons, the Ukrainians outright called them, and I quote, ineffective and obsolete. To Ukrainian territory, they've been relying more on standoff attacks. This means launching missiles from within Russian airspace or from ships in the Black Sea, rather than risking their planes by flying directly over Ukraine. However, using standoff missiles isn't always as effective as sending in strike aircraft. Aircraft can adapt in real time, changing targets, reacting to new information, and providing close air support for ground forces. Missiles, once launched, are much more limited. This has meant that Russian ground forces haven't had the air support they need in many critical battles, leading to stalled offensives and heavy losses. There's also the issue of maintenance. Modern fighter jets require a lot of upkeep. They need regular maintenance to ensure that everything from the engines to the avionics is working perfectly. Russia's aircraft, especially those used in combat, need even more care due to the wear and tear they face. But with the sanctions in place, access to spare parts and specialized equipment has become a serious challenge. Reports suggest that due to heavy corruption, the maintenance crews have had to make do with what they have, leading to less effective upkeep and even cannibalizing parts from other aircraft to keep some in the air. As the war's progressed, we've seen how Russia's had to adapt its tactics in response to these challenges. Early on, they tried to use their aircraft more aggressively, but the losses piled up quickly. Instead of trying to gain air superiority, they focused more on using their aircraft for specific, safer missions. For example, they've been using helicopters for resupply missions close to the front lines, avoiding higher-risk attack missions that put them in the range of Ukrainian air defenses. Helicopters like the Mi-8 and Mi-24, which were once relied on for close support, are now mostly used in more secure roles because their vulnerability to man-pads has been so thoroughly exposed. That's why when Ukraine invaded the Kursk region, they shot down several helicopters that were present on the front lines. And then there's morale. Morale's always a big deal in the war, and for Russian pilots, the situation's been tough. They're flying in an environment where they know they can be shot down at any time, and where their missions don't always seem to have clear strategic goals. Reports of pilots refusing to fly, aircraft being grounded due to maintenance issues, and a general lack of confidence in their equipment have all contributed to a situation where Russia's air force is simply not performing at the level expected of a modern military power. Given all these challenges, it's not surprising that Russia's relied more and more on standoff missile strikes instead of using aircraft in direct combat. But what about the seas? Well, in pure numbers, Russia boasts the world's second largest navy. On paper, that sounds impressive, but as with most Russian weapons, once you start digging a little deeper, you realize there's more to the story. Sure, the Russian Navy is big, but size alone doesn't tell the whole story, especially when we look at how it's actually spread out and how well it functions in practice. You see, the Russian Navy's divided into 4 main fleets: the Northern Fleet, the Pacific Fleet, the Baltic Fleet, and the Black Sea Fleet. Each of these fleets operates in a different part of the world, and they function pretty independently from one another. That means while the total number of ships is high, they aren't all in one place ready to strike as a single powerful force. Instead, they're split up and stretched thin, which really limits how much power any one fleet can bring to a specific fight. When you think of it like that, the idea of having the largest navy loses a bit of its punch. And then there's the question of age. A lot of Russia's ships are actually pretty old. We're talking about frigates, corvettes, and submarines that were built during the Soviet era. Vessels that have been upgraded here and there over the years but still rely on outdated tech. In modern warfare, it's not enough to just have a lot of ships. Those ships need to be equipped with the latest technology, the best weapons, and the strongest defenses. Unfortunately for Russia, most of their fleet doesn't meet that standard. A perfect example of this is the Black Sea Fleet. It used to be considered the crown jewel of Russia's naval power, a fleet that would ensure dominance in the Black Sea region. But lately, it's been facing some harsh realities. One of the biggest blows to this fleet came in September 2023, when Ukrainian forces managed to seriously damage the submarine Rostov-on-Don. This submarine was one of Russia's prized assets. It's a Kilo-class sub capable of launching caliber cruise missiles, meant to be a key part of Russia's strategy in the region. But all that changed with one precision strike. The attack happened at Sevastopol naval base in Crimea early in the morning. Ukrainian intelligence had pinpointed the submarine's exact location, and they launched a coordinated strike using aerial and naval drones. The Russian defenses were caught off guard, and several drones managed to get through, with at least one hitting the submarine directly. The damage was extensive. Later, satellite images showed the Rostov-on-Don partially underwater, with a massive gash in its hull. Now, repairing a submarine isn't just expensive. It can easily run into hundreds of millions of dollars, but it's also complicated. It requires specialized facilities like dry docks and a team of highly skilled workers. Plus, with international sanctions on Russia, getting the advanced parts they need for repairs has become a huge challenge. To make matters worse, just 2 months ago, Ukrainians claimed they attacked and destroyed the same Russian submarine while it was anchored at a port to be repaired in the occupied Crimean Peninsula. If this strike is confirmed, it would be a major embarrassment for the Russian Black Sea Fleet, with one of their top submarines taken out for the second time within just 11 months. But it's not just the submarines that are struggling. Let's talk about Russia's corvettes. These are smaller ships mainly used for coastal defense and patrol missions. Corvettes like the Buyan M-class were supposed to play an important role in defending Russian waters, but their performance in the Black Sea has been, frankly, underwhelming. These ships were designed to operate in riverine and coastal areas and come equipped with caliber missiles. As mentioned earlier, these missiles haven't exactly been the game changers they were hyped up to be. On top of that, these corvettes aren't very well protected. They rely on point defense systems, which means they can only engage threats when they're already pretty close. So by the time an enemy drone or missile's within range, it's almost too late to react effectively. Ukrainian forces have taken full advantage of this flaw, using cheap but effective sea drones to get close enough and deal real damage. Imagine losing a ship worth hundreds of millions of dollars to a drone that costs maybe $10,000 to $20,000. That's the kind of situation Russia's facing. Whether it's a frigate, a corvette, or a submarine, each of these vessels takes a fortune to build, maintain, and equip. Meanwhile, Ukraine is deploying inexpensive drones to take them out. It's such a brutal cost mismatch, and it's forcing the Russian Navy to reconsider where it places its ships. The Black Sea Fleet, for instance, has had to move many of its vessels farther away from Ukrainian-controlled areas, which means their ability to operate effectively has been severely limited. And that brings us to another huge problem for Russia, their ability to reinforce the Black Sea Fleet. Since the conflict in Ukraine intensified, Turkey invoked the Montreux Convention. This international treaty allows Turkey to control naval access through the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits, which connect the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. In times of war, Turkey can restrict naval movement, and that's exactly what they've done. As a result, Russia can't move additional warships from its other fleets into the Black Sea, effectively cutting off reinforcements. So any ships Russia loses in the Black Sea are gone for good, at least for the duration of the conflict. That puts enormous pressure on the fleet, knowing that every loss is a permanent one. Instead of projecting power in the Black Sea, the Russian Navy is now stuck in a defensive position. They're focused on protecting what they have left rather than taking bold actions. It's a far cry from the image of dominance they once tried to project. At the end of the day, if Ukraine continues making massive strides and keeps surprising Russia, Vladimir Putin might feel more inclined to actually use his nuclear weapons. We've already seen him threaten their use a dozen times, but with Putin, you can never really be sure. He's unpredictable like that. But let's talk about why even those nuclear weapons might not be as impressive as he wants everyone to think. They could be just as trashy as the rest of the Russian arsenal. So, how many nuclear weapons does Russia actually have? Well, according to recent estimates, Russia possesses around 5,500 nuclear warheads in total. That number can be broken down into different categories. There are roughly 1,600 deployed warheads, meaning those that are mounted on missiles or located in active bases. Then you have 2,900 non-deployed warheads, which are in storage, ready to be deployed if necessary. Lastly, there are about 1,000 retired warheads, old, dismantled ones that are technically out of commission but still waiting to be fully destroyed. Now, those numbers might seem intimidating, but let's break it down a bit further. Not all of these warheads are currently operational. Many of the so-called non-deployed and retired warheads are just that. They're not ready to be fired at a moment's notice. They're in various stages of readiness, some being stored, others in need of maintenance, and some may even be beyond repair. That leads us to another important point. How much of this nuclear stockpile dates back to the Soviet era? It turns out that a significant portion of Russia's nuclear arsenal, whether strategic or tactical, was inherited from the Soviet Union. The problem is that these warheads have been sitting around for decades, and no matter how carefully they're maintained, age catches up to them. Nuclear warheads aren't like fine wine. They don't get better with age. In fact, the reliability of these old Soviet-era warheads is a major concern. Maintaining such an old stockpile is a logistical nightmare. It's not just about keeping them secure, but also about ensuring they remain functional. Nuclear warheads have complex systems that need regular maintenance, and some components degrade over time, becoming less effective or even dangerous. There's a good reason why countries like the United States regularly overhaul and modernize their arsenals. In Russia's case, there are doubts about whether all these warheads would even work if needed. Typically, nuclear weapons use either plutonium or highly enriched uranium as the fissile core. But there's also tritium, a radioactive isotope of hydrogen that's used to boost the yield of a nuclear explosion. The issue with tritium is that it decays relatively quickly, with a half-life of just over 12 years. This means that the tritium in these warheads needs to be replaced regularly to keep the weapons at their full destructive potential. Over the years, if this tritium isn't replenished, which requires sophisticated facilities and considerable resources, the warheads become less powerful. Or in some cases, they may not work at all. Given Russia's economic struggles and the impact of international sanctions, maintaining a steady supply of tritium is likely a significant challenge. And if they're struggling to maintain tritium supplies, that means a lot of their nuclear arsenal might be less reliable than they claim. But it's not just the tritium. Plutonium and uranium also degrade over time, although at a slower pace. As plutonium ages, it accumulates decay products that can affect the stability and reliability of the warhead. This degradation can make the warhead less predictable, increasing the risk that it might fail to detonate properly, or even pose risks to those handling it. It's one thing to have nuclear warheads, but you also need a reliable way to launch them. Russia has several different launch platforms, including land-based silos, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and mobile launchers. But just like the rest of their arsenal, many of these systems are old and outdated. The land-based silos, for example, are relics of the Soviet era. They may still be operational, but they're far from state-of-the-art compared to the modern, cutting-edge silos that other nuclear powers are using. And it's not just about the silos themselves. There's a serious issue with the reliability of the missiles that are supposed to deliver these nukes. Just take what happened recently. On September 21st, Russia attempted to launch its most powerful nuke delivery system, the RS-28 Sarmat, an international ballistic missile designed to be the centerpiece of their nuclear force. But instead of successfully launching, the missile just exploded right there in its silo before the countdown had even properly begun. This wasn't just a setback. It was a colossal humiliation for Vladimir Putin. And what makes it even more embarrassing is that this particular test was meant to be a show of strength, a clear warning to the West to back off, or Russia will unleash hell. Instead, it blew up in Russia's face, both literally and figuratively. Now, the timing of this failed test couldn't have been worse. Just before it happened, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had gone on Sky News, boasting about Russia's nuclear capabilities, emphasizing that their nukes were ready, locked, and loaded. Hours later, the whole world watched as the missile test, which was supposed to back up all those threats, ended in flames. It's hard to inspire fear when your most advanced weapon can't even make it out of the silo. And you'd think that given the stakes, a superpower like Russia would at least make sure their plan was foolproof before issuing such a high-profile threat. But not Russia. Instead, they chose to launch the RS-28 Sarmat, a missile with a poor track record. Out of its last 6 tests, it had failed 5 times. Clearly, it wasn't the best choice, and it shows just how desperate and reckless Putin's decision-making has become. What makes it even worse is that this isn't some old Soviet-era relic where you could just blame the failure on outdated technology. The RS-28 Sarmat is actually a relatively new weapon. It was first unveiled in March 2018 and had its first test flight in April 2022, not long after Russia began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. According to Russian media, the Sarmat is supposed to be capable of carrying up to 10 large warheads, 16 smaller ones, or even a combination of warheads and other countermeasures, including hypersonic boost glide vehicles. Those are some impressive specifications, at least on paper. Reports from open sources indicate that the missile exploded during the fueling process, right there on the ground, destroying the entire silo and most of the launch site. All of these issues, the aging silos, unreliable launch systems, and failures of new technology, paint a very different picture of Russia's nuclear capabilities than what Vladimir Putin wants everyone to believe. The Sarmat missile, which was meant to be a game-changer, is just another example of the gap between Russian propaganda and reality. And that's just the delivery systems. There's also the question of the infrastructure that supports these weapons. The land-based silos are outdated, and while Russia still maintains a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines capable of launching ballistic missiles, those submarines aren't in great shape either. Many of them date back decades, and maintenance has been an ongoing issue. We've already seen examples of the Russian Navy struggling to maintain even their non-nuclear vessels, many of which have been damaged or destroyed in the conflict with Ukraine. It stands to reason that the nuclear-armed submarines aren't much better off. Even the Bulava missile, which is supposed to be the primary submarine-launched ballistic missile for Russia, has had its own set of problems. There have even been multiple failed test launches over the years, raising questions about its reliability. If the Bulava isn't reliable, then it severely limits the effectiveness of Russia's sea-based nuclear deterrent. The more we learn about the state of Russia's nuclear forces, the clearer it becomes that they're facing some of the same issues as the rest of their military. At the end of the day, the reality is that a nuclear weapon is only as good as the system that delivers it, and in Russia's case, those delivery systems are increasingly showing their age and their flaws. Whether it's the rusty old silos, submarines that are barely staying afloat, or mobile launchers that blow up during testing, it's hard to take Russia's threats as seriously as they want us to. And if the rest of Russia's military performance is anything to go by, from outdated tanks to ineffective naval ships, it seems like their nuclear arsenal might be suffering from the same neglect. It's one thing to have thousands of warheads, but it's another thing entirely to have a force that you can actually rely on.